It's your favorite NPC, and today I will teach you HTML and CSS. In this course, you will learn everything you need to get started building real websites. My first website looked something like this, and it took me forever to make my websites look kinda alright. With my knowledge today, I feel like I could have improved much faster. So in this course, I will teach you everything you need to know so you don't waste your time. I will show you how to set up HTML and CSS before we go over all the fundamental HTML and CSS concepts. I will also show you some advanced techniques and give you some tips and tricks that have helped me over the years. So let's get started, guys. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language and is the foundation of every single website on the internet. It was originally developed by Tim Berners-Lee in the early 1990s to solve a simple problem: how to structure and share information across the web. Before HTML, there was no standard way to display content in a browser. HTML introduced a system based on elements and tags that define the structure of a page. Things like headings, paragraphs, images, and links. HTML therefore focuses on creating the structure of a website. It works together with CSS for styling and JavaScript for interactivity, forming the core of how the web functions. Today, HTML is used in everything from simple landing pages to complex web applications. It hasn't been replaced. It's still the standard, and every website depends on it in some form. You should learn HTML because it teaches you how the web actually works. It gives you full control over structure, helps you build websites from scratch, and is an essential skill for anyone who wants to create or understand digital products. To get started using HTML, we first want to get a code editor, and I'll explain you what it is in a second. But first of all, let's download it. Right here, let's just enter Visual Studio Code and let's search for it. Now you can just press the first link right here. You land on this page, and right here you can just press download for Windows. Installing this will take a short time. Now we can just open the installer right here by clicking it. Right here we press I accept the agreement. Next. Those two marks should be checked, next, and install. This will again take a short time, and once done, we can just press finish right here. And this will open Visual Studio Code for us. So this should be the window that you get. And now let me make this one here a little bit bigger, like so. And now we have a lot of different tabs right here. And the most important one is the Explorer tab right here. Because right here you can open your project. When working with HTML, you always have your project inside of a folder. So you can either press here, open folder, go to your desktop and select a folder. So you could, for example, create a new folder right here and then select this folder. Or alternatively, you can also create a new folder right here. So new folder, let's say HTML course. And now you can just take this folder right here and drag it in here. And this will open the code editor within this folder. So this is your HTML folder right now. So within this folder, you can now create your files. In order to create our first HTML file, we press this icon right here, this new file icon, and give our file a name. A common name for our entry file is theindex.html. And every single HTML file ends with the .html extension. So let's press enter. And by doing so, we've already created our first index.html file. And inside of this file, we can now write HTML code. To create a basic template inside of VS Code, you can just use an exclamation mark and press enter. And this will generate the basic HTML startup template for you without you having to write any code. And you don't have to understand this yet, I'll explain this in a second. So let's save this. And now you can just go over to your folder, the folder that we've previously created, and we can just double click this file right here. So our index.html file. And you can see this will open this file in a new tab in the browser. And this right here is now our website. So as you can see, an HTML file is just a page on our web page later on. And if we just want to output some text, for example, right now, we can just write it within the body tag right here. So we could just say, hello guys. I'm going to save this. Let me open our website again. And as you can see, we're not seeing anything. Every time we do a change right now, we have to reload the page in order to see the change occur on our page. But now, once we've reloaded the page, you can see we have hello guys right here. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So this is the text that we have right now. So what is even the purpose of our editor right here? Why did we install this? Technically, we do not really need this. We could also write our code inside of Notepad, for example. Let me show you. Let me just minimize this tab right here and this one. And now we can just right-click this, open with, and now we can choose another app, for example. So let's just use Notepad. So a basic text editor, essentially. You can see we have the exact same text right here, but it looks pretty flat. And it's probably a little bit harder to read because we don't have colors and so on. But it doesn't really matter. You can also just write text right here. So I could say, hey, this is just some random text, for example. I'm going to save this. Let me reopen our page. And you can see we're getting, hey, this is just some random text. So even though we are just writing inside of Notepad and not using any editor, this still works the exact same. So a simple text editor like this works, but we've installed essentially a better editor that gives us some colors, makes everything a little bit easier to read, and also gives us auto-completion, which you will see in a second. For example, you've already seen it. If we just use an exclamation mark and press enter, this will automatically generate a basic HTML template for us. On the other hand, when using Notepad, you can see I can enter an exclamation mark, I can press enter, but nothing happens. So if you would write within Notepad, for example, so within a plain text editor, you have to write every single line yourself, errors will not be indicated, and a lot of stuff will be a lot harder. Therefore, we use something like Visual Studio Code. And something like Visual Studio Code is also often called an IDE, which stands for Integrated Development Environment. At the moment, you've already seen that we have to refresh our page every time we make a change. So if I write something right here, I have to refresh the page in order to see this change. So isn't there a better way? A way to get those changes automatically, for example. And there is a better way. And in order to do so, we can go to the Extensions tab right here. Right here, you can search for a lot of different extensions. There are extensions for formatting your code, extensions for updating automatically, and so on. And we are searching for the live server because that is the extension that allows us to update our website automatically when a change occurs. So let's click on the first one, so live server. And right here, I've already installed it. But if you do not, you just press the install button right here and wait for the installation to finish. Once you finish the installation, you can just go back to your file. Right here, you can right-click the file and press Open with Live Server, like so. This will now open your page with the live server. Let me make this here a little bit smaller. And now let me just change something on our page. So let's say, hey guys, once again, I'm going to save this and you can see our change occurs immediately on the page. So let's now go over the individual elements right here. Let me first of all make this here a little bit bigger for you so you can see all of this. And also remember that you do not have to memorize all of this. It's just important that you essentially understand the base structure. Because later on, you can always use an exclamation mark and press enter anyways. So as long as you understand what all of this does, it's enough. You do not need to memorize. The first line essentially says that the doc type is HTML. So the type of this document is HTML because obviously it's an HTML document. So this obviously makes sense. Everything in HTML is inside of tags. And usually you have an opening tag and a closing tag. And the opening tag essentially looks like this. And the closing tag looks like this. So you basically have those symbols right here. Within those symbols, you have the tag name. So HTML, for example, or body or head. Doesn't matter. So this is the tag name. And then you have the closing tag. And as you can see, the closing tag has the exact same syntax, but also has a backslash right here. So this backslash tag name and then a closing tag like so. And usually within HTML, we have one root tag that wraps the entire page. And the root tag is basically just the HTML tag. So the HTML tag wraps the entire document. Everything on your website is essentially within this HTML tag. Next up, we have the head tag and the body tag. So within the HTML tag, we usually have head and body. It's also pretty easy to remember because the head is similar to your own head. It stores all of the information. So it stores the information about your web page essentially. Things like the title, the author, the char set, and so on. And the body is also similar to your own body. It is the visible part of your website. So the body includes all of the stuff that you actually see. So things like hey guys, for example. So text, headings, images, and so on. So let me change this title, for example, to Best HTML Course. Let me save this. And you can see right here at the top, we now have the website title Best HTML Course. Let me also show you what this title is in real life. So let's just go over to Google, for example, and let's search for shoes, for example. Doesn't matter. And now you can see right here, we have a shoe website, for example. And the title is essentially just what you're seeing right here. So whatever you define within your title, within this title tag right here, is what a potential customer, for example, would see right here. So Fusion shoes and so on. So all of this stuff. Right here, you can also see that we have a description. So I could also add a description within your head section by using meta::desc. And you can see this here is the power of using an IDE. We can just use meta::desc and press enter. And this will automatically create the meta tag for us that allows us to add a description. The name attribute essentially defines that this here will be a description, and you don't need to understand what attributes are just yet, but just remember that this here says this is going to be our description tag. And the content attribute, again, you do not need to understand attributes yet, but right here we can just define our description. So this is the best course for HTML ever, for example. Doesn't matter. And this description right here, so whatever we've defined right here, will now be displayed right here in the Google search engine, for example. So I think you get the idea. So let's just close this for now. Let's minimize this again. And let's go right here. So again, the head includes all of the information about your website. And of course, there exist a lot more attributes. I'm going to be honest, I've never really used a lot more than those ones. But if you plan on using a lot of them for some reason, then you can always find all of them in the official documentation. So let me show you how you'll find the official documentation. For example, let's go and search for HTML head tag elements, for example. Now we can go over here to W3 School. And right here, you can now read a little more about the head element, the HTML title element, and the style element. Doesn't matter. You'll find a lot of stuff. And right here, you also find a lot of meta tags. So char set, keywords, for example. Right here, you could define keywords like HTML, CSS, or JavaScript for your websites, which is important for search engine optimization, for example. Right here, we have the description. You can also define an author and so on. So you can define a lot of stuff if you want to for your website. And all of them have essentially the same structure. But again, this is not going to be the visible part. So let me introduce you to the visible part, which is the body again. Let's minimize this. And as mentioned, right here, we will have all of the elements that create the visible part of our website. So if I'm just going to enter some text right here, this is something that actually works. And this will display the text on our website. But even though this works, this is not the most ideal way to display text on a website. Because, of course, we have now text on our website. But search engines like Google, for example, do not really understand the structure of our website. Which text is important, for example. Since Google needs to rank you, Google also needs to know what is important on your website and what is probably not that important. If you do a website about sports, for example, and you write sports right here, and then you give some information about sports, for example, doing sports is cool, then this here should, for example, be the title. And of course, the title should be a lot more important than a word like cool or doing, because this does not really describe what your website is about. Sports is what best describes your website, and therefore you want to rank for the tag sports or for the word sports, because if a user searches for the keyword sports on Google, he probably wants to find your website. He probably doesn't want to find your website for the word cool. And in order to structure your page, you use tags. Again, every tag has an opening and a closing tag. There also exist self-closing tags, but we'll get to them later on. So for now, our tags will include an opening tag and a closing tag like so, as mentioned. And there exist a lot of different tags. There exist tags for headings, paragraphs, images, and so on. So let's start by writing our first heading. And we can do so by using an opening tag that says h1 and a closing tag that also says h1. Within tags, you can now define your content. And our content, when using an h1, is text. So it could be sports, for example, like so. And this is how you define your first heading. You can see we also have a different styling, but it's important to understand that HTML is not for styling. HTML only defines a structure. So even though the style is slightly different, that's something that does not matter for us when learning HTML. There exist a lot of different headings. In fact, there exist 6 types of headings. Also the H2. This one could say sports is cool. Now we also have an H3 tag, for example. This could be some random text, doesn't matter. H4, again, some random text. We also have H5, and we also have H6. And essentially, those headings are ranked by importance. When using an H1, search engines like Google will understand that this word is in fact very important and really is essentially the main topic of your page. There should only be one H1 for every single HTML page you have. So this index.html page should only have a single H1 tag. So if your website is about sports, for example, the H1 should probably be sports. You can use H2 tags then to further subdivide your page into multiple subsections. So maybe you have one section about basketball, like so, and then you have another section about football, and maybe another section about the gym. And now you have H3 tags to further subdivide H2 tags, for example. So maybe you want to have different sections for a couple of different players. So maybe LeBron James, then another one for Michael Jordan, and so on. So I think you get the idea. Now you could, of course, further subdivide your H3 tags into H4 tags. Maybe now you want to write about their children. I don't know. You get the idea. Then you could further subdivide H4 into H5 and H5 into H6. So this is what you use headings for. But up to this point, we've only subdivided our page into multiple sections. So one section about basketball, one about football, one about the gym, for example. But we also want to write a little bit of text for every single section. So maybe we want to write a little bit about basketball, for example. So let me just delete all of them. And let's say right below our basketball tag, we want to write a little bit about basketball. In order to just output regular text, we should use the P tag, which stands for paragraph. And now we could, for example, say, basketball is the best sport in the world, like so. And you can see we now have a little bit of text. We can also use a second paragraph right below, for example. So let's use another paragraph. And let's say it makes so much fun. And you can see every paragraph starts on a new line. So if I'm going to use another paragraph and I'll just say, I am playing it a lot, then you will see it will again start on a new line. So every paragraph starts on a new line. So if you take a look at the structure of those tags, all of those tags have pretty much the same structure. You have the opening tag, then you have some content, and then you have the closing tag. So within opening and closing tag, you usually have content. But as I already mentioned, you also have self-closing tags. And the difference between tags that have an opening and a closing tag and self-closing tags is that tags with an opening and closing tag always include content. So they always contain content. Whereas a self-closing tag is essentially the content itself. Let me give you an example. An example for a self-closing tag is the break tag. You also start with this symbol, then you have the tag, and now you can either just close it or you can use backslash and close it. Both of this works. Once we're going to save, you can see that we have added a break. So this break tag is essentially the content itself because it adds a break to your page. It does not contain content itself. It is the content. And that is what you have to remember about self-closing tags. Another important example that you might use from time to time is the horizontal rule. So let's use HR, which stands for horizontal rule. Let's close this tag and let's save this. And you can see we have added a horizontal rule right here. So to summarize, the break tag adds a line break, whereas the HR tag adds a horizontal rule to your page. Let's understand another tag, and that is the strong tag. And I think it's easiest to just show it to you. So let's just wrap basketball with the strong tag. So I'm going to use strong right here. Again, you can see we have an opening and a closing tag right here. And in between this tag, we have our content, in our case, basketball. And you can see now basketball is written bold. But that is not really the purpose of the strong tag. The strong tag is again to tell search engines like Google that this word is especially important. So maybe we want to rank higher for words like basketball. Therefore, we want to use the tag strong to tell Google, for example, that our page is about basketball, and therefore this word will now have a higher importance. It is again not for the purpose of styling. So you don't use the strong tag to make something bold. That is something again that you do by using CSS. Let me also introduce you to comments. First of all, we can just delete all of this since we do not need this anymore. We can save the page. And let me show you how to write a comment. To write a comment in HTML, use this symbol followed by an exclamation mark followed by 2 dashes like so. And this part right here opens the comment and this part right here closes the comment. And in between those tags essentially, you can just write your comment. So this is a comment, for example. So pretty much anything you like. And you see, if I refresh the page, we are still not seeing anything. And the reason for this is that a comment is just there for you and other developers to, for example, understand the code, to share information, and so on. So this is just information that is visible to the person who is seeing the code. It is nothing that will be interpreted by HTML and therefore be seen on the website. Oftentimes you will also see those comments to structure a website, for example. So maybe this here is going to be the heading of your website. This is going to be the main section of your website, and this is going to be the footer for your website. And of course, a lot of developers use comments for a lot of different purposes. But I just want you to know that they exist in case you ever see them or want to use them. You can also write multi-line comments by actually just moving this here a couple of lines down, and now you can write right here. So this is a multi-line comment, for example. And now I'm going to save, and you see this is also basically just a normal comment, just over a couple of lines. Let me now introduce you to lists. And there exist 2 types of lists: ordered lists and unordered lists. And as the names imply, you use an unordered list if the list basically has no order, and an ordered list if you want to have a list that has a specific order. You can create an unordered list by using the UL tag. Again, you have an opening and a closing tag, as you can see. And within the UL tag, you can now define different list items by using the LI tag, which stands for list. Let me show you. So LI, let's press enter. We have again an opening and a closing tag, and you can already see this bullet point. And now we can, for example, add an item right here. So item 1, for example. And now we can create a lot of different items. We can also just duplicate this tab. So we could just create another tag. So let's use another LI tag. And this here could be item 2, for example. And let's have a more realistic example. This here is apple, for example. And this is going to be orange, for example. So this could be a recipe or a shopping list, doesn't matter. Now we can also duplicate this list item a couple more times. If you press Shift, Alt, and the down arrow, then you will duplicate it to the bottom. And now we could also add kiwi, and doesn't really matter. Let's just delete this. So now we have an unordered list, which includes 3 list items. Let's also add an ordered list. And an ordered list has essentially the exact same structure. The only difference is that we're using an OL tag, which stands for ordered list, instead of a UL tag. Let me show you. So let's have an OL tag right here. Again, we need our list items to create our individual list items. So LI right here. And now let's, for example, rank the fastest sprinters of all time. So the fastest one is probably Usain Bolt, like so. So he should be, of course, number 1. Let's have the second fastest one of all time. That is probably Johan Blake, like so. And the third fastest, probably Asafa Powell, like so. And you can see we can use an OL tag whenever the order matters. And if you want to rank sprinters, football players, and so on, doesn't really matter. Where the order obviously matters because someone has to be the best, then you always want to use an OL tag. So to sum up, an unordered list if the order does not matter, and an ordered list if the order does matter. Let me now also introduce you to lists. Imagine you want to link your Instagram profile because you want to get a couple more followers. Doing so is pretty easy by using the anchor tag. And you can create an anchor tag by just using a, so the a tag. If you press enter, you can see that we are getting this a tag right here, and we're also having this href attribute. Again, you do not need to understand this attribute yet, but within this href attribute, we just define the location to which this link should redirect the user to essentially. So imagine we want to redirect the user to Instagram. Then we can just go to Instagram.com, for example. Then we're just going to copy this URL. This could also be a URL to your profile page, doesn't matter. And you paste it in here. So now this anchor tag points to this URL right here, to this Instagram URL, and will redirect the user to this URL when he clicks on this anchor tag. But of course, you also need a text where the user can click on. So go to my Insta, for example, like so. So within those tags, you find a text that will be visible on your website. Whenever the user clicks on this text, so go to my Insta, he will get redirected to the link that you define within the href attribute, like so. So if I'm going to click this link, you can see that we're getting redirected to Instagram. But oftentimes, you also want to make sure that the user opens the link in a new tab when he clicks on this link, for example. And in order to do so, you can add a second attribute, which is the target being equal to underline blank attribute. So you add the target attribute and set it to the value underline blank. And that's something that you basically just have to memorize or look up every time. But you'll memorize this pretty quickly. And now once you press go to my Insta, you can see we're opening a new tab. We still have our website in the old tab right here, but we also have the new tab with Instagram right here. And every time I click this link, you can see I will open a new tab that opens Instagram essentially. So that is what the target underline blank attribute does. You can also use links to redirect to another HTML page, for example. So right now, we only have this index.html file right here, but we only have a single page. And oftentimes you want to have a couple of more pages. If you think about Instagram, you, for example, have a messages page, a contact page, a friends page, a post page, and so on. So you have a lot of different pages. And oftentimes you want to have a lot of different pages on your website as well. So you can also create different HTML files. So you could, for example, create a contact.html file that allows users to contact you, for example. Every new HTML page should also include the basic template, like so. And the rest is essentially the exact same. You could also have an h1 for this page. This here could be contact us, for example, because this is the contact page. And now maybe on our index.html, we want to redirect the user to our contact.html. So for the href attribute, it's actually pretty simple. We just need to define the path to our contact.html. And since it's in the exact same folder, we can just say that we want to redirect the user to contact.html. We can also remove target being equal to underline blank because we want to redirect the user on the exact same page. And right here we just say contact, for example, like so. So now let me click the contact page or the contact link in this case. And you can see we're getting redirected to the contact page, which we see because we now see contact us, which should be displayed on our contact.html page. Right here, we could now also create a link that redirects the user to our index.html, so back to our home page. So let's again create an anchor tag. href should now point to our index.html file. And right here as a text, let's just add home. So when the user now clicks on home, he will get redirected to the index.html page. And when he clicks on contact, he will get redirected to the contact.html page. So you can see this is how you implement navigation in HTML. Let me now also explain how this here works a little bit closer. As you can see, if we are in the exact same folder, it is enough to just reference the file name, or to just type out the file name essentially. But of course, it is also possible that the file you want to reference is inside of another folder. For example, you could have a sub-pages folder. And to create a new folder, you press this new folder icon, in case you didn't know. So now imagine we're having the subpages folder, and now my contact.html file is within the subpages folder. Let me now go to the index.html file. And now, if I'm going to save this, and I press contact, you can see that we're getting this error. Cannot get /contact.html. And the reason for this is that this path is now wrong because of course our contact.html is not within the exact same folder anymore. It is within the subpages folder. And referencing a file within another folder is very easy, to be honest. You just use the folder name right now, so sub pages like so, and to say that you want to get into a folder, so go inside of a folder, you use a /. And now you can just define the file that you want to access, so contact.html for example. If you would have another folder within the subpages folder, so let's just say within the subpages folder we have another folder, let's just say this here's the subpages folder. Doesn't matter, doesn't make sense, but for now let's just imagine that's the case. And now our contact.html is within the subpages folder. So now again, to go into the subpages folder, we first have to go from our current location into our subpages folder, like so, and now into our subpages folder, so subpages. So let's go inside of that one, and now we have to reference our contact.html file, like so. So you can see this here works as well. But now, as you can see, if you take a look at our contact.html, so let's go to contact, and now we want to go back to home, this does not work anymore, because our contact.html is now within our subpages folder, and our index.html is 2 levels higher. So now we need to say that we want to go outside of the subpages folder, outside of the subpages folder, and then access our index.html. So previously, we went into the subpages folder, into the subpages folder, to contact.html, and now we have to go the exact opposite way. So outside of the subpages folder, outside of the subpages folder, to our index.html. So I hope that makes sense. And in order to go one level up, so to go outside of a folder, you have to use a // like so. So this is the first level. And now you can use another // to go one level higher again. And now you can see we are already getting the index.html as a suggestion. So now we can just reference our index.html. Let's click that one, and you can see our navigation now works again. And to really visualize this to you, if you say subpages / for example, this is just equivalent to clicking subpages right here. If you now would say subpages / this again is equivalent to just clicking this page. And now just typing out contact.html is essentially equivalent to just linking to this page. If you're now within this folder, saying // is equivalent to going one level back. Saying // once again is again equivalent to going one level back. And now again you could just reference the index.html by typing it out right here. So I hope you understand how this works. This is literally just navigating within a folder by typing it out. So by using this syntax. But for now, let's just delete all of this because we do not need a contact.html anymore. So let's continue. And on our index.html, let's also delete our anchor because we will not need it anymore, like so. So now we have an empty page once again. Now I also want to introduce you to images, because from time to time you maybe want to display an image. In order to display images, you can use the image tag, so img. Let's just press enter. Again, Visual Studio Code will just create the element for us, like so, with the necessary attributes. For the image tag, that is the source and the alt attribute. And you'll understand them in a second. The source essentially references the file that we want to display, and the alt is an alternative text that will be displayed if the image cannot be loaded. For example, because the user does not really have a proper connection, the image is not available currently, or if he is visually impaired, a screen reader will also read out the alt text, because obviously visually impaired users can probably not see the image. So displaying an image would not really make too much sense for them. But you'll understand in a second. First of all, of course, we need an image. And I will just get an image from Unsplash because the images over there are copyright free. But you can literally use any image you like. So I'm just going to click the first link. All of those images right here should be copyright free. So I'm going to download one. I'm going to take this image, drag it into our folder right here. and I'm going to rename it because this will make it a lot easier in a second. I'm just going to say this here is cool.jpg, like so. So this is our image name now. Let me just close this one right here, and let me also close our image right here. And now to display this image, we just have to reference it again. So we just type out the name followed by the extension, so .jpg. Let me save this, and you can see we're getting our image right here. You can see it's way too big, and I'm going to rescale it for you so you see that this actually works. But usually you don't want to use HTML attributes to resize your image. You always want to use CSS. But since we do not have CSS yet, I will show you how it also works within HTML. So you can define a width like so, and you can just say 100 pixels or 400 pixels, doesn't really matter. I think you get the idea. Again, you do not have to understand this. You will usually use CSS for this anyways. But you can see this here is now the image. And as I've already mentioned, you should also always define an alt text for images in case the image cannot be loaded or for visually impaired users, since the screen reader would then read the alt text. And right here, you could essentially just say cars on grass, for example. Doesn't matter too much. I think you get the idea. Let me again demonstrate how this works if you have an image inside of a folder. Oftentimes you will have an images folder like so. Then you will have this image within the images folder like so. And now it works the exact same like before. You just define the folder name followed by a slash followed by the name of the image like so. So images/cool.jpg, and this will have the exact same effect. So to summarize, to display an image, you use the image tag. The source attribute defines the path to your image you want to display, and the alt text gives an alternative text in case the image cannot be loaded or in case a user uses a screen reader. Width and height can also be defined, but that is something that you actually do not want to do, and I just did for the purpose of showing you that this is actually the real image. Now that you've also seen images, I want to explain attributes a little more, because we've used them a lot already, but I've never really explained them. And maybe you can already imagine, but attributes exist to give additional information for a couple of elements. And some attributes, for example, are mandatory for a couple of elements, whereas other attributes are, for example, optional. If you think about the anchor tag that we used previously, if you remember the target equals underline blank attribute, that is an optional attribute. You can add it if you want to add or open the website, the linked website, inside of another tab, but you do not have to add it. But a couple of attributes are also mandatory. If you think about the source attribute, for example, an image without a source does not really work. Therefore, you need to use a source attribute for an image tag. So every image tag needs a source attribute to define the path to the actual image that you want to display. You always define the attribute within the opening tag in case you have an opening and a closing tag. If you think about the anchor, for example, you can see you define the attribute within the opening tag, so within this tag. You never define the attribute within the closing tag. Most of the important attributes will get generated automatically by VS Code if you just enter the element name like so and press enter. You can see the important attributes will automatically get generated. So for image, the important ones are source, which defines the path to the image, and alt, which is the alternative text. And that is something that is really nice about Visual Studio Code, because it makes it a lot easier for you and you do not have to memorize all of the important attributes. But you remember them anyways if you just code a little bit. So that's not a problem as well. So to summarize really quickly, attributes get defined within the opening tag and they add additional information to an element. Some attributes are mandatory and required for certain elements, and some are optional. Some attributes also only work with certain elements. For example, a source attribute works with an image tag, whereas it wouldn't really work with an anchor tag. Let me now introduce you to containers. First of all, let's just delete all of this. Let's save this again. And let's take a look at the two container elements that really exist. There exists a div and there exists a span. So what will you use those containers for? A container essentially just wraps other content usually and is used to group related content. right now a container will seem pretty useless to you, but it gets especially important once you start working with CSS, because then you can use containers to really style your content, and then you will also understand the difference. So even though it might seem unnecessary for you once I show it to you, just remember that those are really, really important concepts. So let me explain. Let's start by taking a look at the div. Imagine we're just having an h2, and that one talks a little bit about basketball. You also have a short paragraph. Basketball is cool, for example. And now let's just take this container and paste it in here. And let's say this here says football and football is cool. So as you can see, the first div essentially groups related content, so basically content about basketball, and the second div groups content, related content, so basically content about football. And of course, you could do the exact same by using a span, like so. So let me replace a div with a span right here, and you get the exact same result. So both of those elements are containers. They just wrap content within them. You could also just write text in here. So you could also say hello, or doesn't matter, just this random text. And now let me just delete this span right here, and let me just copy and paste this span in here. So let's also have some random text here, and you can see we are getting this text and this text. So I can output text right here as well, but that is something that you should actually not do. A container should be used to group related content. It should not be used to output text. If you want to output text, again, use a paragraph, because that is the element that was made for outputting text. But this here is really good to show you a key difference between divs and spans. As you can see, the text that I've written within the span sits next to each other. If I'm going to use a div though, hello, and I'm going to duplicate this div by using Shift, Alt, and down arrow again, and I'm going to say hello bro, you can see hello and bro sit below each other, whereas Job, Adstas, or whatever you want to say, sit next to each other. And the reason for this is that a span is an inline element, and a div is a block level element. What exactly does this mean? This means that a span, if you have content within it, only takes up the necessary space, and other elements can essentially sit in line, so next to each other. So a span can sit next to a span. A div, on the other hand, is a block level element, which means a div always, no matter how big the content is, takes up an entire row. So the div essentially goes from here, so from the H, to the end of this row. Every new div, therefore, starts on the next row, or in a new line, if you want to think about it like this. So a div takes up an entire row. A span only takes up the necessary space to display the content. And that is the key difference between a span and a div. And if you remember block element and inline element, that is something that is really important and will make your life a lot easier in the future. Let me also show you the console and the Elements tab, because that will give you a deeper understanding of websites. Let me open this right here. Let me right-click the website and let's press Inspect. If it looks like this for you, you can press this icon right here that will toggle between different devices. So you can see this here is how it looks on a desktop, this here is how it looks on a mobile device. And you can also resize it right here. So that is the first thing you can be aware of. But that is not that important for us now. But if you open this right here, you can see that we have a lot of different tabs right here. And a couple of them are pretty important from time to time. The first one is the Elements tab. As you can see, the Elements tab includes all of the elements of your website. If you hover over the HTML tag, you can see all of the elements that exist within this HTML tag. Since the HTML tag on our website wraps the entire website, or to be precise, every other element, hovering over the HTML tag will create this blue box around our entire website. If we now hover over our head, you can see we will not see any box right here, because again, the head only includes information about our website, therefore we are not having any content. Hovering over the body will again highlight pretty much everything, because essentially all is part of the body. We can now also open our body right here, hover over our span, and you can see the blue box around our span shows the size of our span, and since it's an inline element, it will only take up the necessary space, therefore only the space of our element, and the same goes for our second span, of course. If we now take a look at our div on the other hand, you can see that the blue box goes from the left to the right. So the div takes up the entire row, and the same obviously goes for the other div. So this here also visualizes the difference between inline elements, so spans for example, and block level elements, so divs for example, once again. So the Elements tab is pretty important when you work with HTML. But since you will later also learn CSS and JavaScript for example, I also want to introduce you very quickly into some of the other tabs. You do not need to understand them perfectly yet, but it's good if you've heard of them. The Console tab is essentially pretty nice because it will display JavaScript code later on for example, and that is something that you will use once you learn JavaScript. Sources essentially includes a couple of sources that might get a little more important later on, but for now it's not really that important. The Network tab displays how long your resources might take to load, for example. Also have a status code. That's not that important for us at the moment as well. And as you can see right here, we have a couple more tabs. But the most important ones for now are Elements, and later on, once you start working with JavaScript, the Console tab. So let's close this, and let me show you that this tab actually exists for every single website. So I can see the structure of every single website by right-clicking the website and going to inspect. And now in the Elements tab, if you take a look at Facebook, you also can see the exact structure of this website. You also have the head, you have the body. Within the body, you have a couple of things. You have divs, for example. You have a lot of divs to be precise right here. Let's scroll down. Inside of the divs, you have more divs. Right here, you have an image, for example. If you take a look, once you hover over the image has a blue box around it as well. And I think you get the idea. If you want to see where a certain element is within the tree, for example, you can just right-click it and inspect. And this will, within this tree structure, jump to the exact element. So let me take a look at the input feed, for example. Let me press inspect. And you can see we are jumping to our input element right here. We didn't learn inputs yet, but that is something that you will use for a form. And by using inspect together with the Elements tab, you can basically understand pretty much any website. Right here you also have a lot of styles. That is not that important for us yet. You will learn that once you start styling with CSS. So let's close this, and let's go back to our HTML code right here. Let me now introduce you to tables. To create a table, you first use the table tag, like so. But as you can see, we're not seeing anything. And the reason for this is that you of course need to define your columns and your rows. To create a new row, we always use the TR tag, which stands for table row. To this row, we now have to add columns. To add a column to a defined row, you use the TD tag, which stands for table data. And now within this TD tag, you can define your content. We could, for example, say that this here should be the name. Now let's create a second column right here. And this one should have the age. And now let's have a last one that includes the biceps size, for example. So now we have one row that includes 3 columns, name, age, and bicep size. And now we can create another row. Let's, for example, say that our first row should essentially include the placeholders, and our second row should include a couple of specific values for a specific person, for example. So TD, our name is going to be NPC, age is going to be 28, and bicep size is going to be 144, like so. And now we have a second person, so let's just duplicate this row. We'll add a second row, or a third row in this case. And right here we have Jonas. He's also 28, but he has a bicep size of 2 centimeters, for example. So he has a pretty small biceps. So now we can just add rows over and over again by using TR to add a new table row. And now we can populate those table rows by using TD, which stands for table data, to create new table data for this row. But maybe we also want to structure this a little bit better, because at the moment we do not really know whether this here is just basic table data or maybe the heading of our row. And in this case, name, age, and bicep size are, for example, table headings and not just normal table data. Therefore, we should mark them as table headings to add a little bit more structure. So to say that something is a table heading, we use th, which stands for table heading, instead of td for the data essentially. And you can see we now have this bold outline. Again, this is not for styling though. This is again to tell search engines like Google how the structure of this table looks like. So let's just replace all of them with our th tags like so, th, and th like so. And this is how the table can essentially already look like. But if you want to describe even further to search engines how your table is structured, then you can do that by using t-head, t-body, and t-foot. So we can, for example, say that this row right here is the head of our table. Therefore, we can use t-head and put all of this content within the t-head. And this here is the body of our table because it includes the actual data. Therefore, we use t-body right here and put all of the content into this t-body tag. And now maybe we also have a t-foot. In our case, we do not really have a t-foot, but let's just make one up. So let's just use another table row for our footer. And let's have some table data in there. Usually you would use that to summarize numbers, for example. So if you have a table consisting of numbers, you can use that one to summarize the sum, for example. But in our case, we do not have that. So let's just use random numbers. 23, 20, or 43, and maybe 77. Doesn't matter. I think you get the idea. So this is now the footer, the table footer. This is the table body. And this is the t-head. Let's now get to one of the most important topics of this course, forms. If you think about a page like Instagram, for example, you know that you have a section to register, for example, a section to log in, a section to contact Instagram, and so on. And all of this is a form. So a form basically allows user to enter some input that will later get submitted to your page. And let me just create a form and then explain it to you, like so. So this is what the form looks like. You have an opening tag and a closing tag. And everything within this tag belongs to this form. Every form tag should have an action and a method attribute. And I'll explain them to you in a second. But first of all, let's take a look at a couple of important input elements. Instead of this form tag, you can now add input elements that allow the user to enter input essentially. And the simplest input field is an input of type text. And when using Visual Studio Code, you can just use input, which is the tag, followed by the specific type of input you want to add. And you can see we already have a lot of different suggestions. So button, checkbox, color, date, date time, email, and so on. But we want to have an input of type text. So you just enter this within VS Code and then press enter. And VS Code will automatically create an input of type text for you that includes the most important attributes. But for now, we can just delete name and ID since we will not need it for now. Like so, we have an input of type text. And as you can see, we can now just enter some text right here. If you want to have an indicator that shows the user what this input field is about, then you can use the placeholder attribute. And that one is a really important one because you will use it on pretty much every input field. And this here could be an input field for a username, for example. Now we can of course also create an input for email, so input type text. And this one could have a placeholder email, for example. And this here technically would work, but it's not ideal because there exists a type email inside of HTML. So we should use a type being equal to email if we want the user to enter an email. So whenever there exists a specific type for a specific purpose, you want to use this type. And again, if you just enter input colon inside of VS Code, it will basically display all of the existing types to you. So let me just show the most important ones to you. An important input is, for example, the input of type date that allows you to essentially pick a date. So this one adds a date picker. Then there exists the input of type password, which you will use whenever the user should enter a password. And you can see this is kind of nice because it allows you to enter a password and the text is basically hidden. You can also add an input of type file, for example, that would allow you to upload a file. So let's add this one as well. Let me save this. And you can see now I could just choose a file from my desktop, for example. Let's take a look at a couple more. So input of type checkbox is something that you might want to use from time to time. And that one just adds a checkbox. If I duplicate the checkbox, you can see that I can tick this one, I can tick this one, and I can also untick this one and untick this one. If you want to connect multiple checkboxes essentially, then you can use a radio button. So use an input of type radio, like so. And you can see now I have this radio button right here. And let me just duplicate this radio button. So now I have two radio buttons and I can check both of them. So they are not connected yet. To connect them, use the name attribute. You give both of those radio buttons the exact same name, and this tells HTML that those two radio buttons are now connected and only one of them should be selectable. So I could just say this here is, for example, the gender radio button, like so. And now I can check this one. But once I check the other one, this one will get deselected and the other one will get selected. So checkboxes, if you want to give the user the possibility to basically just check or uncheck a certain field, and radio buttons if you need to connect several fields. Let's take a look at the range input field, like so. And that one essentially just allows you to select a range. And that one also has a couple of attributes, for example, min, which allows you to set a minimum value. This one could be 0. Max, which allows you to define the maximum value, which could be 50. And you can also set a default value by using the value attribute, like so. And this one could be 25, for example. Or let me say it's 10, because then you will see the difference. So now this here is 10, this here is 0, and this here is 50. But now, up to this point, the user does not really have the possibility to submit this form. And to submit a form, you usually want to have a submit button. And there exist two different possibilities to submit or to add a submit button. The first one is to basically just use a button of type submit, like so. So this is the button, and now you can, within the tags, add the text that you want to add. So submit, for example. So now we have this submit button. And whenever I click this submit button, the form will get submitted. What does submitting the form mean when it comes to HTML? Submitting the form means to execute the file that we define within this action attribute. And usually this is going to be a PHP file. So index.php, for example. Let me just reopen this with the live server. Let me press submit. And you can see we're getting this page isn't working. And let me just reopen this by using the live server, like so. Let me change this here to a GET request. And now I'm just going to press submit right here. And you can see we're getting cannot get /index.php. And the reason for this is that we obviously do not have an index.php file. But usually you would create an index.php file. That file will get executed and then store all of those values on a server. But that is something that you'll learn in my PHP course. So that is nothing you have to worry about at this point. But just remember, whenever you press a submit button, so a button of type submit, the file that you'll define within this action attribute will get executed. And the method used to execute this file will be the method you define within the method attribute. In our case, it's the get method. What does get mean? Get is basically a method to submit your data to a server that is not secure. If you submit this file using the get method and you have a name, for example, then the name will get added to the URL, like so, for example. So this is how this would look like. And of course, everyone who would get this URL or see this URL would then know your name. And in this case, it's probably not that bad. But if you would have a password, for example, and you will submit it like this is of course not secure at all. Using a get method is not really secure at all and is something that you definitely want to avoid if you have sensitive data like credit card numbers, passwords, and so on. So most of the times when submitting a form, you actually do not want to use get. If you want your data to be secure, then you always have to use a post request, like so. If you submit your data using a post request, then the data will be submitted in a secure way that will at least make it a lot harder for attackers to get the data. So when having sensitive data, always use a method being equal to post. If you want to give the user the opportunity to bookmark something, for example, if you have a shopping page that has a lot of different shoes, then using get can be kind of useful because if you think about a shopping page, then you have index.html/shoe being equal to 1, for example. Then the user can just copy this URL, paste it somewhere, send it to someone, and the other person will have a bookmark and get the exact same shoe, for example. So when bookmarking stuff, this can be kinda useful, and then a GET request might make sense. But for most cases where you have sensitive data, you definitely want to use post. The second method to get a submit button is to use an input of type submit essentially. And right here you define the text for the button within the value attribute. So this here could be a register, doesn't matter. And now you have a register button. And there's not really a difference between using input of type submit or a button of type submit, but I usually just use the button because obviously, in my opinion, a button is made to be a button. So I use a button of type submit. And if you want to have a reset button, then you can also use a button of type reset, for example, like so. So one for submitting, one for resetting. Obviously, resetting is something that you barely want to do, but in case you ever want, this is the reset button, and that one will essentially just reset the entire form and therefore clear all of the input elements. Something that is useful about using the right type, so for example type email, is that when submitting the form, you will also get errors within HTML. So hello, for example, I'm going to press submit, and you can see we're getting this warning. Please include a net in the email address. So HTML already gives us a little bit of feedback if something is missing. This is not really a way to validate whether the input was correct, but it is a first step, I would say. Something that you might want to use from time to time is also a text area. So right now we only had a couple of input elements, an input of type text, for example, that allows us to enter a little bit of text. But maybe you have a super long blog post and the user should add a lot of text. Under those circumstances, a text area might make sense, like so. I'm going to save this, and you can see now we have this text area. We can also add a couple more attributes, so let me delete name and ID, since we do not need this at the moment. And we can also add something like calls, which stands for columns. And now we can, for example, say we want to have 10 calls, or we want to have 30 calls. And maybe we also want to have a couple more rows. So let's add rows, and let's say we want to have 30 rows. So now we have a lot more rows and a lot more columns. But actually, you'll barely ever use calls and rows. I just wanted to show you that this works. Nowadays, you actually use CSS to style your text area. Let me also explain a name attribute a little bit closer, because as you can see, VS Code usually generates the name attribute automatically. So it somehow has to be important, right? And it is because the name attribute will be used within your backend to store data on the server. So I do not really have to understand this too much at the moment, because I'll explain this a lot more in my PHP course. But the name attribute will be used as a name, or as a key to be precise, if you store your data on a server later on. So it might make sense to add a name of username, for example, right here, because then later on the key will be username and the value that will be stored on the server will be the value the user enters right here. But again, if you do not understand this yet, that doesn't really matter. Hey guys, it's me again, and I actually forgot to introduce you to one important element, which is the label element. If you have an input, let's create an input of type email, for example, and you want to have a label for this input that precisely describes what this input is for example, then you can of course use the placeholder as already mentioned. So you could say this is our email field. But there is also a second possibility, which is the label. Let me show you. So I can just create a label like this, and now you can add some text right here. So I could just say email right here. So now we have this email label. But what is the purpose of a label? Why can't we just use a normal paragraph, for example? Usually you can link this label to your email field, and clicking on this label will then highlight this email input field. And in order to do so, you need to add an ID attribute to your input field. And now you can define a specific ID. The ID can be email, for example. Something that is important about the ID is that an ID has to be unique. So this ID of email can only be used once on the entire page. So if you have a second input field that is also of type email, for example, let me show you. So let's have an input of type email. And you also want to define an ID. Then the ID cannot be email again. It can be email 1, 2, email with 2 L's, for example, and so on. But it cannot be the exact same ID. So that is important. An ID has to be unique. And now you can link this label to this input field by using the ID. And you define or you specify this ID that you've defined right here for our input within the for attribute right here. And this will now link our label to our input field. And if I'm now going to click on the label, you can see that we're immediately getting redirected to the input field, and we can now enter our text. Let me show you again. We are clicking on the label, our cursor jumps into the email field, and we can now enter the value. So you can either use the placeholder, or you can use the label, or of course you can also use both combined. So that's up to you. At this point, you know pretty much all of the important stuff when it comes to HTML. There's only one important thing missing, and that is semantic HTML. If you think about all the stuff that we've learned up to this point, you realize that a lot of the things only had the reason to tell a search engine what your page is about. For example, you could also write some text like this. Nevertheless, you use a paragraph to write some text like this. And the only real point of a paragraph is to really structure your page. And usually every page should have a certain base structure. Every page should have a header, a main section, and a footer. Like so. And later on, within those sections, you have the actual content. For example, you could have an H2 about basketball within the main section, then a little bit of text, another H2 about football, and so on. So all of this stuff would belong into the main section because it is the main content of your page. So the main section includes the main content of your page. So essentially, the content the user is coming for. If you have a blog about sports, for example, then the main section includes all of the content about sports that the user might be interested in. The header, on the other hand, includes things like navigation, for example. If you think about Instagram, for example, you have this navigation bar at the left. And this is not really the content we are coming for. This is just some content that enables us to navigate on the page. So that enables us to get to the section we are interested in. And this here is basically the content that would belong into the header. This allows us to navigate on the page and so on. The main content, in fact, would be the post or all of the posts, because that is the content we are interested in. What is the footer? The footer is essentially just some additional information, copyright information, information about the company, contact information, and so on. And if you think about Instagram, it's basically the bar right here at the bottom. That is about, blog, jobs, help, API. That's nothing the user really comes for, but it is content that might be necessary for a couple of us. So that belongs to the footer. And those ones are the most important tags in HTML, but you can further structure your page. If you have a navigation bar, like the nav bar on Instagram, you usually put that one into the nav tag. So this here says that all of the links, all of the nav links should be within this nav bar. So this here is the wrapper for our navigation bar. If we have an anchor, for example, that redirects the user to a contact page, another anchor that redirects the user to an About Us page, and another one that redirects to our homepage, for example, then this is the navigation bar and should be within a nav tag. Usually you can also further subdivide your main section into multiple sections, for example. And to do so, you can use the section tag like so. For example, you could have one section that talks about sports, then you could have another section that talks about cameras, and you could have another section that talks about getting rich, for example, doesn't matter. And within each section, you want to have a little bit of content. In the sports section, for example, you want to have a couple of articles. For example, one article about basketball. So let's have an H2 in here that says basketball. Now we have another article that maybe is about football. Article like so, and H2 football. And now each of those articles has an H2, maybe also a paragraph that has a little bit of text. Doesn't really matter so much, like so. So a section basically groups related content on a page, whereas an article is more or less some content that does not need any other content. If you think about an article about basketball, for example, you could just take this article and put it on any other page and it would still make sense, because it's just an article about basketball. It does not need to be on this page to make sense. So it's more or less a piece of self-related content that makes sense on its own, even if it doesn't belong on this page. Whereas a section subdivides your page into multiple subsections. So a section more or less belongs to the page. If you have some content on your page that does not really belong to the page, but is still on the page, for example an advertisement, then you want to use a site, for example. So right here you could add an advertisement, for example, that does not really belong to the content, so it's basically a side from the rest of the content. I'm going to be honest though, I barely ever use section, article and a site, and I really try to focus on having header, nav, main and footer. But of course, if you want to be 100% precise, I of course recommend you to also use section and article. And that is all you really need to know about HTML. In case something is still not clear or you have questions, I would always recommend you to use ChatGPT for coding, since when it comes to coding, it is, in my opinion, really good. It knows pretty much all of the stuff you need, especially when it comes to simple languages like HTML, and you can literally ask it pretty much anything and you'll get a good response. I would recommend you to probably practice a little bit coding with HTML, and afterwards you can definitely go on to CSS, because at this point you know how to structure a website, but the website still looks terrible. And if you really want to make it beautiful, you have to learn CSS, because HTML defines the structure of your website, but without CSS, it will never look good. It's your favorite NPC, and today I'll teach you CSS. In this course, I will teach you everything you need to get started programming in CSS. The first website in the internet looked like this. And since no one wants his website to look like this anymore, every single web developer learns CSS these days. In this course, I teach you everything you need to get started. I show you how to set CSS up before we start talking about all the fundamental CSS concepts. And then we are going to build 3 projects together. And the last project will be a full HTML and CSS website where you can practice everything you've learned up to this point. I've designed this course for anyone who wants to learn CSS. So even if you're just a beginner, you'll be perfectly fine. So let's get started, guys. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet and controls how a website looks. It was introduced in 1996 by the World Wide Web Consortium to solve a key problem: separating design from structure. HTML defines the structure of a website, but without CSS, everything looks plain. CSS lets you control colors, fonts, spacing, layout, responsiveness, and a lot more across an entire website. Instead of styling elements one by one, you define rules that can apply everywhere, making your design consistent and easier to manage. It also enables modern layouts with FlexBox and grid, as well as animations, transitions, and so on. Today, CSS is used in every website. No matter what tools or frameworks you use, CSS is always part of the final result. You should learn CSS because it gives you full control over design and is essential for turning a basic website into something that actually looks good. For this course, I'm going to use VS Code as a code editor, but feel free to use anything you like. Right now, I only have this index.html file that includes a basic HTML template. And now there exist 3 ways to use CSS together with HTML. You can include it externally, internally, or you can write inline CSS. The most common method is external CSS. So let me show you how to include it externally. In order to do so, you create a separate CSS file. You can do so by, for example, creating a new file and giving that file any name. A common name is style.css. Every CSS file has a .css extension. So let's press enter, and now we've created an external style sheet. Now we need to reference this style sheet in our HTML code. And in VS Code, this is pretty simple. You just use link :CSS and press enter, and this will already create the link template for you. So we are using a link to link our style sheet and connect it to our HTML file. The rel attribute is usually equal to style sheet. This just says that the relationship is essentially a style sheet. And href then points to the location. In our case, since our style.css is in the exact same folder, we can just say style.css. And this is actually all we really have to do. If I'm now going to write a line of CSS, for example, and you do not have to understand this one yet, but if I'm going to say background is equal to blue, for example, or black, doesn't matter, you can see that our background is now black. So our style sheet has been applied successfully. If you have your style sheet inside of another folder, so let me create a CSS folder, for example, let me move the style sheet in there, like so. And now, of course, you have to change or define the new location where HTML can find your style sheet. So in our case, we need to go into the CSS folder /style.css. So this just works the normal way. Now I can show you that this works again. Background black, and you can see we have a black background. So to link a style sheet externally to your HTML file, you use the link tag and you define the path to your file inside of the href attribute. That's external CSS, and that's also the most common method. If you remember one of those methods, that's the one you should remember. But there exist two other methods that I want to show you. The second one is internal CSS. And the difference is actually just that instead of linking your style sheet in the head, you write it in the head. So I use a style tag right here, and inside of this style tag, you can now define your CSS styles. So I can actually just say that I want to have a background for our body, for example, of blue. Again, you do not need to understand this, but now we have a blue background. And the last method is inline CSS. And that is something that you definitely do not want to use usually. You can do it if you just want to test very quick, because it is a pretty quick way to write CSS code, but it's not a clean way. And it will make your code a lot harder to maintain in the long run. But let me show it to you. For every single HTML tag, you can also use the style attribute right here. And now you can just define a background, for example, or pretty much any other CSS property by writing it inside of quotation marks. So background of black, for example. And you can see this works as well. So to summarize, you can link an external style sheet by using the link element inside of your head. You can use internal CSS by using the style tag in your head, or you can use inline CSS by using the style attribute that every HTML element has, and then within quotation marks, you can just define the style. But from this point on, we'll only use external CSS. And usually you will always use external CSS. So that's also the recommended way. So let's link our file once again by using link:/CSS and pressing enter. And this will again link our style sheet. Our style sheet is currently inside of our folder. So let me move it out of there like so. And let me also delete the CSS folder like so. And now this should work again. So now our style sheet is linked to our HTML file. Now that we know how to link our style sheet, let's talk about selectors. Because you have elements inside of HTML, but you somehow need to be able to select those elements inside of CSS to target the right elements. Because of course you do not want to apply styles to every single element. Maybe you only want to apply styles to your body or maybe to a paragraph. And you've already seen the element selector, which I use right here. You use the element selector by essentially just typing out the element. So the element body will get targeted by just typing out body. I can also target a paragraph, for example. Let me write a little bit, like hello. So hello. And now I can just target our p tag by using the p selector, so the p element selector, like so. And now I can also say our paragraph should have a background of yellow, for example. And you can see now we have a yellow background behind our paragraph. So that is the element selector. If you would have a div, you would just say div, like so. For a list, you would just use ul, ol, whatsoever. So I think you get the idea. So that is how you select a specific element. The next way to select an element is the ID selector. Let me show you. If you think about this paragraph, for example, you can also define an ID for this element, like so. And now you can specify an ID name. And this can literally be anything you like. You can come up with a name and it works. Most of the times you will of course use descriptive names because this makes your code a little bit easier to read. But you don't have to, you can also use X theoretically. Just doesn't make too much sense. But right here, if you have a name, for example, like NPC codes, then an ID name of name might make sense, for example. And now you can target this ID within your style sheet by using a hashtag followed by the ID that you've specified. In our case, name, like so. And now you can again define a background of red, for example. Something that is important to know about IDs is that an ID is unique. You can only use an ID once per page. So it should not have two paragraphs that have the exact same ID. That is something that you definitely want to avoid. An ID should only be used once. So if you would like to have a second name, then you should use name 1, for example, or pretty much any other name. But using it twice is something that you do not want to do. If you want to reuse something multiple times, then you should use a class selector. A class is essentially like an ID, the only difference is that a class is not unique. So I can reuse a class across multiple elements. And it's really useful if you want to define a style once and have a couple of different elements styled the exact same way. So if you think about a card, for example, it might make sense that every card on a website looks pretty similar, or an input field, for example. So under those circumstances, a class might make sense. So I can say this here is the class of cool, for example. Doesn't matter. And now I'm just going to say hello, I duplicate this, hello again, and so on. Doesn't matter. And now I can target every element that has the cool class by going to my CSS style sheet using a dot. A dot means I want to target a class, followed by the class name. And now again, I can just write a style, and you see this style gets applied to every single element that has the class .cool. Also, you do not have to understand this syntax right now. I'll explain this in a second as well. Those ones were the most important selectors. And if you remember any of the selectors I'll tell you right now, those are the selectors that you should remember, because you will literally use them 99% of the time. But I want to show you a couple of other selectors that you will see from time to time probably, so you'll at least recognize them. So let me delete this, and let's imagine that we have a div right here. So let me wrap all of this content inside of a div, like so. And let me also have another paragraph outside of the div. And that one says, I am outside of the div. And let me also just delete all of them and replace them with the normal paragraph that says, I am inside of the div. So now this is a little bit clearer. So we have one paragraph inside of a div and one paragraph outside of a div. And now I could, of course, just target all of the paragraphs by using the P element selector like so. And I could give them a background of yellow. But imagine I only want to give a background of yellow to all of the paragraphs inside of a div. Under those circumstances, I can say div space P. And this means target every single P element that is inside of a div. So let me save this. And you can see now only a paragraph inside of a div will have this style, this background of yellow. Every paragraph that is outside of a div will not get this background. And it also doesn't really matter how the structure is. So even if this paragraph is nested deeply inside of this div, like so for example, it will still get applied. So it does not need to be a direct child. Also, since I'm already using those words, what is a child and what is a parent? Essentially, the element inside of another element, so let me delete this and let me delete this. The element that is inside of another element is essentially the child. So this P right here is a child of this div because it is inside of this div. And this div is a parent to this paragraph, so to this P tag, because it wraps the paragraph. If you take a look at this div, for example, and this paragraph though, those ones are called siblings because they sit next to each other. So they are essentially on the same level. And this is especially important for a couple of selectors I'll show you right now. Because right now, we are targeting every paragraph that is somewhere inside of a div. So as I already mentioned, even if we have a span wrapping our P tag, we are still going to select this P, because it does not matter how deeply nested this paragraph is. But now I can also say I only want to target a direct child to this div. What is a direct child? A direct child sits directly under the div, so it's just one level lower essentially. Let me show you. So I can target a direct child by using this symbol right here. And this will only target a direct child. So right now, our P tag is a direct child because it is right below our div. If I'm going to move it into our span though, so let me remove it right here and let me place it inside of our span, you can see that our style is now gone because only our span is now a direct child to our div. Our P is now a direct child to the span, and it's not a direct child to our div anymore. It is a child to our div, but not a direct child. And that is really an important difference when using this selector right here. So the direct child selector. Now there also exists the sibling selector. Let me show you. So let's just use a plus. And you can see we are selecting the second paragraph. So a direct sibling to our div, because it is on the exact same level and it sits directly after our div. Let me also show you what happens if I have another paragraph right here. I am the closest or nearest nearest child, for example, like so. And you can see we're only going to select the nearest or the direct sibling to our div. We're not going to select every sibling. And the closest sibling, so the sibling that follows our div, is the first paragraph right here. The second one is a sibling of our div, but it's not a direct sibling. So that is important to understand about the plus. It will only select the nearest sibling, but not every sibling. If you want to select every sibling that follows, then you have to use the tilde symbol like so. And this means select every following sibling of this element. Now there also exists an attribute selector. Let me show you that one very quick. So let's have an anchor tag, for example, and that one will have href of www.google.com. And now this one redirects to Google, for example. Doesn't matter. This link will not even work, but it's enough to show you how this works. And now we only want to target an anchor tag that redirects to Google, for example. So maybe this here redirects to Instagram, but we only want to select the anchor tag that redirects to Google. And in order to do so, we can use the attribute selector. So we can say we want to select every anchor tag. Now we use those braces right here. And right here we say that our href, like so, needs to be equal. Let's just copy it right here to www.google.com. And only then we are going to select this anchor tag. So let me give it a color of red. And you can see our first Google link is now red. And the second one goes to Instagram, like so. And that one still has the normal default style applied by HTML. You can also make this a little bit more specific. You can also use this symbol right here. And then you could just say www, for example. Let me save this. And this will select both of the anchor tags, because this here means, does this href attribute start with www? And in both cases, it does. If I'm going to say www.sw, for example, then you can see our second link will not get selected anymore because it does not start with www. So this operator essentially means, does this start with this? You can also have include, like so, by using the asterisk, and this will still target both of them. If I'm now going to delete one of them, you can see that the second one will not get targeted anymore. If I'm going to add it right here though, you can see Instagram will also get targeted once again, because now we have www within this link. It's just at a different position. So when using this symbol right here, the position does matter, because this means, does this start with this specific value right here, whereas this asterisk means, is www anywhere inside of this string. And now, of course, you can also check whether something ends with a specific character sequence. And in order to do so, you can just use the $sign like so. Obviously, nothing ends with a www. So let's, for example, use .com like so. And let's, for example, change Instagram to .de. And now we'll only have this result for google.com. So I think you get the idea. To summarize it very quickly for you, to target a specific element, you just use the element name, A for example, for an anchor tag. To target a specific ID, you use a hashtag followed by the ID name. To target a specific class, you use a dot followed by the class name. To target an element inside of another element, you just use the parent name followed by the child name. To only target direct childs, you use this selector right here. To target the nearest sibling, you use a plus symbol. To target every sibling, you use the tilde symbol like so. And to target a specific attribute, you use those braces followed by the attribute you're looking for. For example, href equals whatever, you get the idea. And that is how you target specific HTML elements instead of CSS. Let's now delete all of this. And let me also delete the anchor tags because we will not need them anymore. Now I want to explain the CSS syntax to you. In order to do so, we can just use a basic paragraph, and let's just have a text hello, for example. Now, as we already know, we can select our p tag by using several ways, but we can just use the element selector, for example, and specifying the element name, so p. This will target all of the paragraphs on our website. Now, after every selector in CSS, you will have those curly braces, and inside of those curly braces, you define your rules. So the rules that you want to apply to those elements, to the elements that get selected by using the selector. And a rule can look like this. You define something like background, for example. So that is a property, the property that you want to target. After the property name, you use a colon. After the colon, you define a value for this property, for example, red. And every single statement, so every single property value pair ends with a semicolon, like so. So you always have the same structure. The selector, then the braces. The braces wrap all of the rules that get applied to the selected elements, and those rules consist of property value pairs, to be precise. So you have a property name can be background, for example. It can also be color, and so on. So there exist a lot of different properties that you can define, and you just have to memorize them or look them up, but we go through them step by step. And of course, after the property name, you use a colon, followed by the value, the specific value, and you'll end the statement by using the semicolon. So that is pretty much a structure that you'll always see inside of CSS. And if you understand that, you've already understood the basic concept of CSS. Now that you know how this works, let me introduce you to one of the most important properties, the background property that we've already seen a couple of times. So I can define a background, or to be precise, a background color, by using the background minus color property and just define a color name like aqua, aquamarine, azure, and so on. And this will just use a background for the selected element. You can also just use background, and this is just a little bit shorter, but this works as well. But there exist a lot of different ways to specify colors. You can just define a name, but you can also use the hex code, for example. So you could, for example, also just say hashtag FFF, which is white, save this, and now you will get a white background, which you will not see because, of course, white on white is basically invisible. But you could also use a different hex code, so hashtag E06D60 is a form of red, for example. So you can use color names or hex codes. What exactly is a hex code? A hex code is essentially just a representation of color represented as a text. And every sequence of characters essentially belongs to a certain color. So this sequence of characters right here belongs to this red, for example. So this is just a way to specify colors by using text. You can also use RGB values. Let me show you. So RGB, then you use opening and closing brackets. And inside of those brackets, you have to define three values. A value for red, a value for green, and a value for blue. And every value can be between 0 and 255. Why is that? The reason for this is that RGB works, and we are able to define every single color by using RGB between 0 and 255. Is obviously that every single color is made up out of red, green, and blue. And by mixing red, green, and blue, you can get any other color. So if you say, for example, that you want to mix 255 of red, so basically have pure red, together with 0 and 0, so 0 for green and 0 for blue, then you will basically just get pure red. If you only use 100 for red, then you will get this form of red. But now, of course, you can also mix red and green by using 100, 100, and now you will get this color right here. So this is basically some form of yellow. If you say 255, 255, then you will get pure yellow. So mixing red and green, for example, will result in yellow. And that is how all of this works. Now you could, of course, also add blue, for example. So 255 of blue. And if you take all of them at the maximum level, then you will get white. If you take all of them at the minimum level, then you will get black, obviously. So by using RGB, you essentially just mix colors to generate any existing color. And now you can, of course, also use RGBA, and it works the exact same. The only difference is that you can add transparency, so an alpha value. And that alpha value can be between 0 and 1. 1 stands for maximum transparency, so you just basically have the normal color, like so. Whereas 0 means full transparency, which essentially means it's invisible. But now you can, of course, also use a value in between, like 0.5, which means it's 50% transparent. And let me show this to you for red, for example, like so. And you can see we have a slightly transparent form of red. So I hope you understand how this works. And actually the easiest way to get a color is by just going over to the Google color picker, for example. And right here, you can just pick a random color, for example, like so. So you can just grab a color, doesn't matter, that's up to you. And right here, you see a representation of that color as a hex code. So I can just copy this hex code. You also see a representation of this color as an RGB value. So you can also just copy the RGB value. And then you can basically take this value right here. So copy that one, paste it in here. Let me minimize that one. And I'm going to save this. And you can see we're getting this color as a background. So to summarize, you can represent colors by using their names, by using the hex codes, by using the RGB values, or by using the RGBA values. And that is something that does not only apply to background colors, that is something that applies to all of the colors you will ever see in CSS. So if you define a text color, it works the exact same. Let's now take a look at background images. And let's actually set a background image for our entire body. So for all of this right here. So I'm going to target our body element like so. And to set a background image, use the background minus image property. Alternatively, you can also just use the background property. So this works as well. Now you have to use the URL function right here, like so. And inside of this function, you can now define the path to the background image that you want to use. So let's first of all download a background image that we want to use. I'm going to use Unsplash in order to do so. So let's go to Google, let's enter Unsplash, let's click the first link, and let's select a background image that we want to use for our website, for example. And I'm going to search for seamless pattern, for example. But choose whatever you like. I'm just going to download the first one. It also doesn't need to look too good, to be honest. It's just for demonstration purposes. So I'll drag it in. I'll rename the image to bg.jpg. And now I'm going to go back to our website. And inside of this URL property, we now have to define the path to our image. And in our case, it's bg.jpg because we're in the exact same folder. Of course, if this image would be inside of a folder, then I would have to use the folder name /bg.jpg. So I think you get the idea. This is just completely normal, the same way you would do it in HTML. I'm going to save this, and you can see now we have a background image for our body. But you can see it still looks pretty weird, and there exist a couple of different properties to control how a background image should look like. The first one that is pretty important is background minus size. And right here, there exist different properties, and VS Code already suggests us the most important ones, and those ones are especially contain and cover. And you'll especially oftentimes use cover, because that just means cover the screen. So you can see now it covers the screen. Let me also show contain to you like so. So what is the difference between contain and cover? Cover essentially just says cover the entire screen, even if you have to cut off a certain part. Contain means please show everything, even if there's something that is white in the end. So even if there's something that is not filled. So let's keep using cover right now. And as you can see, the background right here repeats. So in order to change that, we can use the background minus repeat property. And right here, you oftentimes want to say no minus repeat to not repeat the background. And you can see our image still covers the entire width of our background, but it does not repeat anymore. If I'm going to use contain, I think now the difference should be pretty obvious. You can see we're only getting this result. So it does not cover the entire width of the page anymore, but it will keep its aspect ratio. So the aspect ratio is correct, but it is possible that there exist white spaces. Let me also show you the background minus position property, because that one is kind of important from time to time. And right here, you can just say things like left, right, top, bottom, center. Let me show you center, for example. And you can see this just centers the image. We can also use left right here, which aligns our image to the left. And we can also use right, which aligns our image to the right. So I think you get the idea. You would not really see this too much if we would use cover, because now right, left, and center would look pretty similar. Now you could use top and bottom as well, and there you would see a slight difference. But under those circumstances right now, using cover together with our background position property does not make too much sense. So I'd rather use contain right here. And the reason that this here does not position our image to the bottom is that our body only takes up the minimal necessary height. I could change that by using a height that covers the entire screen, but that's a topic for another video. So I'll introduce you to this later. So to sum up, you can set a background image by using background together with the URL function. You can control the size of this background by using background minus size, and oftentimes you will use cover. You can also define whether the background should repeat or not by using background minus repeat, and you can define the background position by using background minus position. Let's now delete this and let's understand a little more about text. We already have our text right here, so our paragraph. But how exactly can we style text? And text does of course not only have to be a paragraph, it can also be an H1 for example, an H2 and so on. So this here is of course text as well. But how can we style it? How can we change the font? How can we change the color? How can we change the thickness? And so on. So let me show you. First of all, let's go to our style sheet and target all of the P text for example. And now imagine we want to have a different font family. We can do so by using the font minus family property. And right now, VS Code will already suggest us a couple of pre-installed fonts that we can choose from. So something like Arial, Times New Roman, and so on. So pretty much every PC has a couple of pre-installed fonts, and those are a lot of those fonts. So I can just choose Arial for example. So let me just choose that font and I'm going to save this, and you can see we now have a different font for our paragraph right here. So right now this here means if the font Arial is installed on the system, we're going to pick Arial. Otherwise, if Arial is not available on the system, we're going to pick Helvetica, and if Helvetica is not installed on the system, so on the user's PC for example, then we are going to choose any font that does not have serifs, so sans serif. So then the system is going to decide by itself. So those two fonts are essentially backup fonts. So I could also just write Arial, and this would be the exact same result, but it would be bad if a user does not have Arial installed and then just randomly gets another font, because this could of course break the design you're choosing. So it might be smart to use a backup font. Of course, oftentimes you also want to use different fonts. Maybe you want to use a font that is not pre-installed on a system. And you can do so by using Google Fonts and embedding their fonts on your website. So let me show you how this works. You're going to go over to Google Fonts. Right here, you can browse for a font. So you can just choose a font that you like. A lot of people use Roboto, for example. So you can just press on the first font right here. Now you can just press on the Get Font icon. You can either download the font, but embedding the font is a little bit easier most of the times. So you can just press Get Embed Code. And right now, you can just copy this code right here. You're going to take that code and you can now paste it into the head of your HTML file right here, right before linking your style sheet, like so. So this is how this works. So now you have linked the font within your project, and now you can reference the font by using font minus family, Roboto for example. And as a backup, they suggest using sans minus serif. So any font that does not use serifs. So let's get back to our CSS code. Let's go to our page so we actually see the difference. And let me just use font minus family, Roboto, sans serif. And you can see it looks a little bit different. But the difference to Arial is not that big. So I'm going to apply that font to our H1 as well, like so. And you can see we have a different font for our heading as well. So let me also explain to you how this works. Let's go back to our index.html, and right here we've linked our font. And you can see we're actually referencing this page right here within the href attribute. So let me just copy this link right here and let me paste it in here. Let's press enter. And you can see this is what we're getting. And this right here is the definition of how the browser should get the font. The font in fact lies on the Google servers. We are requesting the font from the Google server and then getting this font within our project. And this is what you call a CDN, a Content Delivery Network. Because we're not embedding the font directly in our project, but instead we are requesting the font from the Google servers. The Google server responds and gives us the font, and then we can use this font inside of our project. And right here, they defined the rules of how we can get this font. So that is why we need to use this link within the head of our HTML file. So I hope you understood this, but even if you did not, it's not really that important as long as you remember how this works. And if you want to get a deeper understanding, you can also read a little more online. There's also another option to embed fonts into your project, and that is actually just downloading the font and embedding it into your project. And that's something I've barely ever seen. I just want you to know that this is possible, but usually you will just use a content delivery network like Google. For now, let me explain to you how you can change the size of a font. For example, if you take a look at our heading is pretty big. Maybe we want to have a slightly smaller font size. To change the font size, you can just do font minus size, and right here you can define the font size. You can do things like large, larger, X large. So I think you get the idea, but most of the times you will just use pixel values. Let me show you. So you can just use something like 16 pixels, and that is the default font size of most browsers. You can also use 20 pixels. You can use 40 pixels, 100 pixels, and so on. So let me explain to you what a pixel is. Every screen is made up of pixels. If you have something like a TV, for example, or a normal desktop screen, doesn't matter, it looks something like this. And then every image consists of pixels. And a pixel is essentially just a square. And then you have a lot of those squares next to each other. And every single pixel has its own color. So maybe one pixel is yellow, for example. The next pixel could be red, for example. And then you might have another pixel that is purple. Doesn't really matter. So I think you get the idea. And in the end, an image is just a combination of a lot of pixels. So even though the entire image exists of squares, it does not really seem like that to you because you have so many pixels that you cannot really realize that all of this is essentially just a square. In the end, you have probably here a pixel, here a pixel, here a pixel, here a pixel. And after a while, once you get enough pixels, essentially, you can see this might look like a head. Obviously, I don't have enough pixels right here, but I think you get the idea. At a certain point, you will just not see the blocks anymore, and you will just see a normal head, for example, or whatever you see on the TV. And if you define a font size of 40 pixels, for example, then you say the font should have a size of 40 of those pixels, so 40 out of those building blocks. And if you think about Full HD, for example, those screens, for example, have 1920 pixels of width and 1080 pixels of height. So that is Full HD, for example. And 4K is 1920 times 2 and 1080 times 2. So pixel values are essentially just absolute values that define the size of a font. If you want to define the size of text, there also exist em and rem. So let me demonstrate it to you. Let's, for example, say we want to use for em. You can see our text gets a little bit bigger. You can also say for rem. And you see, we have the exact same font size. So what is the difference between em and rem? And what is even em and rem? Rem always refers to the font size of the root element. What is the root element? The root element is our HTML element, because the root wraps every other element on your HTML page. So the HTML element, because the HTML element wraps every other element on the page. So that is the root element. You can target the root element by using :root, for example, like so. And now we can, of course, also for our root element define a font size, like so. So we could say 10 pixels. Let's save this. Let me also delete the font size right here. And you can see our paragraph now has a slightly smaller font size, and our H1 also has a slightly smaller font size. The reason for this is that a lot of CSS properties, including the font size, will get inherited from the children. So if you define the font size, for example, for a parent element, like the HTML element, which wraps the entire page, so every other element on the page is a children of the HTML element, then all of the children will inherit this font size that you've defined for the parent element. If I'm now going to say for h1 that I want to have a font minus size of 20 pixels, we will use this absolute value of 20 pixels or 40 pixels. That doesn't matter. But of course, I can also define a relative font size for h1 that orients its scaling on the font size of the root element. So I can say for rem, which means 4 times the font size of our root element. Since we have 10 pixels right here, this is equivalent to saying 4 times 10 pixels, so 40 pixels. I can also say 10, and now I'm getting 100 pixels of font size because the font size of our root element is 10 pixels. If I'm going to change the root font size to 4, for example, you can say that this font here gets smaller as well because we're scaling our h1 font size according to the font size of our root element. So I hope you get the idea. If I'm now going to say m instead, you see we're still getting the exact same effect because m orients to its closest parent where a font size is defined. But if I'm now going to use a div and wrap our h1 and p tag with a div, for example, like so, and now I'll define a font size for this div, for example, like 10 pixels, for example, so font minus size 10 pixels, you can see that this here gets a lot bigger because m orients its font size to the font size of the closest parent element. And the closest parent element right now is our div. I could also set a font size for the body. Maybe I'll say font size 20 pixels. Nothing changed because at the moment our closest parent where we have a font size defined is our div. If I'm now going to delete the font size for our div though, then the closest parent will be our body, and therefore we will have 10 times 20 pixels. So 200 pixels of font size for our h1 element. And you see it gets super big. If I'm now going to use rem though, even though we have a font size defined for our body, it is going to take the font size as a reference of the root element, which is 4 pixels, so 10 times 4 pixels, 40 pixels. And you can see it's a lot smaller right now. So rem uses the root element as a reference, whereas m uses the closest parent where a font size is defined as a reference. So that is the difference. And pixel values are always absolute values. So if you just want to have a fixed value, you use pixels. Let's also delete this and let's understand font weight. If you take a look at our heading, you see that the thickness of the text is pretty big, whereas the thickness of our paragraph is pretty small. But maybe you want to have a thicker paragraph or a thinner heading, for example. In order to change that, we can use the font minus weight property. Right here, you can use text values like bold or numeric values like 100 to 900. Let me first of all show the text values to you, so bold. And you can see now our paragraph is bold. I can also use something like thin, for example. Now we have thin text. And you can see we have a lot of different text options. So you can just go through them yourself. We have bold, bolder, light, normal, and so on. But most of the times you will just use numbers. 900 is super bold essentially, and 100 is super thin. And everything else is in between. And the text value bold is essentially 600 as a number. Changing the color of text is actually pretty simple. You just use the color property. And the rest works exactly the same as for backgrounds. So I can either use a color name, like blue for example, or yellow, that's up to you. You can also use a hash code like hashtag FFF, which would be white. So we can also say hashtag 6C, 3E, 3E, like so. Now we have red. Or we can of course also use RGB values. So RGB of maybe 255, 150, doesn't matter. And of course we can also use RGBA, which again includes transparency as the last value. So we can add a value between 0 and 1, for example 0.4. And now we have a color that has 40% transparency, or only 40% visibility to be precise. Let me also introduce you to text align. If you want to align your text, you can use the property text minus align. And you can align your text to the center, for example, like so. You can align it to the right, like so, or to the left, like so. If you have a little more text, so let's imagine we are having hello guys, this is the best course online. Trust me, bro. Like so. Imagine that is what we're having right here. And now I want to have a little bit more spacing between those lines. And we can do that as well in CSS by using the line minus height property. And right here, you can define a line height. 1 is just the normal default value. 2 is, of course, a little bit more. 0.5 would be a little less. So by using those values, you can essentially define the spacing between characters. And of course, you can also use super big values like 5, 10. That's up to you. But I think 1.2 is kind of right. And let's also take a look at text minus decoration. From time to time, you maybe want to have an underline, you want to have an overline, you want to have some stuff like that. And you can do so by using text minus decoration. Text decoration of underline adds an underline, for example. Text decoration of overline adds an overline. Text decoration of line through, for example, adds a line through, and so on. So you have a lot of different options. But actually, the option that you will probably use most often is going to be none. Why actually none? Let me show you. The reason for this is that every time you have an anchor tag, so let me add an anchor like so, and that one says Google, for example. Every time you add an anchor, HTML will by default add this underline right here. And this underline, of course, doesn't look too good. So something that you might want to do pretty often is target an anchor tag, and then you will just say text minus decoration of none. Because now the underline is gone. And I think this looks a little bit better already. So let's just delete all of the styles and let's now understand width and height. In order to do so, we will first of all create a div. And let's just start to style this div. So let's go back to our CSS file. Let's target our div. Let's give it a background so we can actually see what's going on. And let's say the background is yellow-green, like so. But at the moment, we're not seeing anything. And the reason for this is that our div does not have a width and it does not have a height. So we can specify one by using the width property like so. And now we can, for example, say that our div should have a width of 50 pixels. But we're still not seeing it because it still doesn't have a height. So we also need to define a height of maybe 50 pixels as well. And now we can see that we are seeing a yellow-green block. Of course, we can also say we want to have a height of 100 pixels. So that is up to us, but I want to have a square for now. Now there also exists the max width and max height property. And they are especially great if you want to have a responsive layout. Let me show you. Imagine we're defining a width of 1000 pixels. As you can see, we're having this block right now, but this block is super big and we need to scroll. And for responsive layouts, like mobile phones, this is not really good. So we can use max width under those circumstances, like so. And you can see, now our square fits on the page. And the reason for this is that our max width essentially says you can take up a maximum width of 1000 pixels, but if the space is not available, you do not have to take up that space. So you can shrink if necessary. And if I'm now going to resize this window, you can see it can take up a width of 1000 pixels, so essentially the entire screen basically. Otherwise, it can shrink if the space is not available. And using max width is especially important if you want to create responsive layouts that also work on a mobile phone, for example, or on different screen sizes in general. Let me now also explain different units to you for scaling. You've already seen the pixels unit, and you've already seen M and rem for text. But if you want to scale a div, for example, you can also use things like percentages, for example. So I could, for example, say, take up 10% of the available space, or take up 20% of the available space, or 50%. So that is up to you. It does not work for the height like that though, so let me show you. Because by default, the body element, so this one, only takes up the minimal necessary space. So by default, the body has a height of 0. And if you now say, take up 50% of the available height and there's no height available, then of course 50% of 0 is still 0. So by default, the body has a height of 0 and a width of 100%. And now you say, essentially for your div, take up 50% of the available space of the parent element and 50% of the height of the parent element, and then draw my div. And under those circumstances, of course, this div is going to be invisible. If I now say 50 pixels though, this works. So let me show you how this works by creating another div. So I have this div, and now I want to have a div inside of a div. And let's say this div will have an ID of container or parent, doesn't matter. And this div will have an ID of child. So this div is the child of the parent. Now let's target our hashtag parent, for example. Let's say our parent will have a width of 50% and a height of 500 pixels, for example. Let's give it a background of yellow. And actually 50 or let's say 100 pixels, that should be enough. And for the color, I'll use something that is a little bit darker. Now I also want to target our child, like so. And now I'm also going to give our child a width of 50% and a height of maybe 50 pixels, like so. And for the background, I'm just going to use a random color, so maybe yellow, green, like so. And you can see now our child takes up 50% of the width of the parent element, which is in this case hashtag parent, so the div, the parent div. And our parent div takes up 50% of the parent container again, which is the body in our case. And the body by default has a width of 100% and a height of 0. But since we've used absolute values for the height, that does not matter. But we scaled our width of the hashtag parent element relative to the parent container, which is the body, and the width of our hashtag child relative to the width of our parent. So 50% of 50% are equal to 25% of the entire body. So that is how this works. Width and height always refer to the width and height of the parent container. But you can also use units like viewport width and viewport height. So for example, 60 viewport width will take up 60% of the available space of the viewport. And the viewport in our case is this entire window right here. And by doing so, we are not limited to the size of our body container, but we rather refer to the viewport. And that is also great if we want to create designs for different devices, for example. Because by doing so, it does not matter whether we are on a mobile device or a window device. We will always take up, in this case, 60% of the available width of the device. And in this case, for example, 40% of the available height of the device. So I think you get the idea. Viewport width and viewport height refer to the device width and height, whereas percent refers to the height or width of the nearest parent. And if you just want to use absolute values, again, you can use pixels. So usually you can use pixels, em or rem, if you want to define the size of fonts, so of text. And you can use pixels, percentages, viewport width and viewport height if you're working with things like divs, for example. Let's now understand comments in CSS. So let me just delete all of this. And imagine we wanted to create a node for ourselves, for example. In order to write a comment, you use a / followed by an asterisk, and you end the comment by using an asterisk followed by a / again. And in between those asterisks, you can essentially write your comment. So this could be a node for myself, and this can also be a multi-line comment by just moving this down. That my biceps is getting too big, like so. So I'm saving this, and you can see we are not having any effect on the page because a comment will essentially get ignored by the browser. So whatever you write within a comment is just there for yourself or other developers as a note, for example, as a reminder, and so on. So you can essentially use comments to document your code. So let's go back to our HTML code and let's just create a basic paragraph right here instead of having our divs. And that one could, for example, say, hello guys, like so. So right now we are having this output on our page. But maybe I want to have a border around our paragraph. So how can I create borders? In CSS, you can create borders by using the border property. So we first select our p tag, or every single p tag, then we use the border property like so. And right here, we now have to define a couple of values. To be precise, we have to define 3 values. The first one is going to be the border width. That can be something like 1 pixel, 10 pixels, 30 pixels. So I think you get the idea. I'm going to use 1 pixel for now. As a second value, you have to define the border style. This can be something like solid, for example, like this. And as the last value, we have to define a border color. This can be something like black, for example. This could also be an RGB value, like so. So 100, 100, 100, and so on. Now, when I'm going to save this, you can see that we are now having a border around our text. Let me show you how this changes once I change the values. So let me just use 10 pixels, for example. And you can see we are now having a thicker border. I could also change the border style, for example. So instead of solid, I could, for example, say I want to have a dotted border. And you can see now we have a dotted border. Or let me also try something else. Let's maybe try double, for example. Now we have two borders. We can also use dashed and so on. So there exist a couple of border styles. To be honest, those were the most important ones, and you'll probably use solid most of the times. Let me also show you a different color. So let's maybe just use pure black, like so. And you can see we're now having a black border. Of course, we can also use yellow, yellow-green. So that is up to you. The box model is one of the most confusing things for a lot of beginners, but it's actually really easy. In HTML, every single element can be represented as a box. Imagine this paragraph, for example, that includes a little bit of text. This can be visualized as a box. Right around the paragraph, we have a second box. This box represents padding. Usually, this box is invisible, because padding is set to 0 by default. The third box represents the border. This one is also not visible by default, because there's no border unless you define one. If you do define a border, you will see that it is just a rectangle around your element. The outer box is called margin. This one is also not visible by default, because margin is usually 0. So what is the difference between padding and margin? If you set padding or margin on your page and do not have a border defined, it can be hard to tell the difference, because both just add space around the content. If you add a border, however, you will see that padding adds space between the content and the border, whereas margin adds space outside of the border around the entire element. Let's now take a look at the box model inside of CSS and HTML. In order to do so, let's first of all go over to HTML, so to our index.html, and let's create a basic p tag. Instead of this p tag, let's just have a little bit of text, so maybe hello bro, like so. Now we can visualize our CSS by maximizing this window. Let's right click on the element and let's press inspect. And this will open the Elements tab. And you know this Elements tab from HTML already, but right below this Elements tab, you also have those tabs right here. So styles, computed, layout, event listeners, and so on. And when working with CSS, especially the styles tab is important, because you can essentially go over an element, click that element, and you will get all of the styles right here that you defined inside of your CSS code or that HTML adds by default. If you take a look at the body element, for example, by default we have a display of block and a margin of 8 pixels. So a lot of elements in HTML will have a default margin of 0 pixels, but a couple of them will also have a little bit of margin added to them by default. So HTML just adds that by default. And the body is one of those elements. So the body by default has a margin of 8 pixels. You don't need to understand margin and padding yet, I'll explain that in a second. But just remember that you can click on an element like the p tag and you will see a lot of CSS styles. And if you now scroll down, you will also see a visualization of the box model. And that one is really great to take a look at an element. If we hover over the p tag, for example, you can see those boxes right here. And you can also hover over the box right here. And if you hover over the center box, for example, you will see a blue rectangle right here. And that one is the visualization for the content of the paragraph, so for the inner content box. You can always hover over the different boxes and you will get a visualization of those boxes. If you hover over the padding box, for example, you will see that we are not seeing anything, and the reason for this is that we're not having any padding yet. So you see we have padding of 0 at every single side. So it's also possible to specify different padding for top, right, bottom or left, and the same of course also goes for border and margin. But I'll show that to you in a second. If we hover over our border, we also have a border of 0 pixels, so we're not seeing anything. But this is slightly different for the margin. So once we hover over the margin box, you can see that we have a little bit of margin top and bottom. So again, by default, the browser adds a margin top bottom to paragraphs of 16 pixels. And we can see that margin once we hover over this box. So that is how our paragraph currently looks under the hood. So now let me show you how the box model changes once I add a border, for example. So let's, for example, add a border to our paragraph instead of CSS by targeting our paragraph. And now let's add a border of 1 pixel, solid black, for example. Let me go back to the page, and you can see now we have a border of 1 pixel around our paragraph. And you can see, once we take a look at the box model, we also see that we have a border of 1 pixel at every single side. But now you can see that we have 4 sides, and we just defined the border for every single side at once. So isn't there also a way to define a border only for the top or only for the bottom? And of course there is. Once we go back, we can say that we only want to have a border top, for example, of 1 pixel, solid black. And you can see we only have a border top, for example, right now. And right here, we also only see a border of 1 pixel at the top inside of our box model. Let me minimize this for you for now. And let me show you the other properties. So I can of course also say border bottom, like so, which adds a border to the bottom. We can say border minus left to add a border to the left, or border minus right to add a border to the right. So by using border, you add a border to every single side, or you could specify to which side you want to add a border by using top, right, bottom, or left. So that is up to you. But for now, let's just add a border to every single side, because that will allow us to understand padding a little bit better. Let's go back to the page, right-click the element, inspect. Let's go back to the box model. So imagine we want to add a little bit of spacing between our content, so the text, and our border. In order to do so, we have to use padding, as you can see, because padding is between content and border. How can we add padding in CSS? That is really easy. We can just use the padding property. So padding, and right here, we now have to define a value. So maybe a value of 40 pixels. This will add 40 pixels of padding into every single direction. Let's go back to the inspector, and you can see this is the content. We now have padding of 40 pixels into every single direction and a border of 1 pixel. So we added some padding between content and border. Now again, we can only add padding to the top, bottom, right, or left by using, again, padding minus top to add some padding to the top, padding minus bottom to add some padding to the bottom, padding minus right to add some padding to the right, which you will not see because there already is enough padding, or enough space to be precise, and padding minus left to add some padding to the left. There's also another shortcut. So of course you can use padding, 40 pixels for example, to add 40 pixels into every single direction, but you can also specify 2 values at once. So 40 pixels, 20 pixels for example. And this here says add 40 pixels, top and bottom. So the first value defines the padding for both top and bottom, and the second value defines the values for left and right. So top, bottom, left, right. So to sum up, 1 value for all 4 sides, 2 values, top, bottom, left, right, like so. And you can also use 4 values. So you could say 40 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, 10 pixels. And this would now be 40 pixels top, 20 pixels right, 30 pixels bottom, 10 pixels left. So top, right, bottom, left. So you can either use 1 value for padding, 2 values for padding, or 4 values for padding. Or alternatively, you can of course also use padding minus top, like so, padding minus right, bottom, left. So I think you get the idea. And now, let's imagine we want to have some margin outside of the element. So outside of the border, we want to add a little bit of space. Let's scroll down. We now have a little bit of padding to the top. We have our content, we have a border, and we have a margin top bottom of 16 pixels. So one option would of course be that we don't want to have the standard margin HTML adds. In order to do so, we could essentially just say that we want to have a margin of 0 into every single direction. And you can see the margin is now gone. We can also say that we want to add a margin of 40 pixels into every single direction. So now we have a margin of 40 pixels into every single direction. Again, the syntax is similar to padding. Let's also say 40 pixels for padding. And now we can also say, or we can also specify 2 values. So top, bottom, left, right, for example. So now we have 40 pixels to the top and to the bottom, and only 20 pixels to the left and to the right. Or we could say 0 left and right. We can also specify 4 values. So 40 pixels top, maybe 100 pixels right, maybe 40 pixels bottom, which doesn't even matter because we have enough space to the bottom, and maybe 10 pixels left. Whoops, 40 pixels and 10 pixels. And you can see this here is the result. So 40 pixels top, 100 pixels right, 40 pixels bottom, 10 pixels left. And of course, we can also use margin minus top, like so. Let me save this. So now we have a margin top of 40 pixels, margin right, 40 pixels, margin bottom, should not change anything because we have enough space there, or margin minus left, like so. So this works pretty similar to padding. Let's now understand display block, display inline, and display inline block. Let's delete all of this for now, and let's also delete this right here, and let's just have a div. And you know, a div by default is a block level element, which means, let me just type something out, hello for example, and right here I have hello again. You can see this here is a block level element because it essentially takes up an entire row, so an entire block. On the other hand, I have a span right here that says hello from span again, and you can see they're sitting next to each other. So they're essentially sitting in line. That's why they are called inline elements. So what exactly is the difference? Let me, for example, now try to add a background to our div. So div will get a background of maybe green, doesn't matter. Let me also add a background to our span. So let's say our span has a background of blue, for example, like so. Now for our div, maybe I want to have a different height though. So let me say height 100 pixels. And you can see every single div now has a height of 100 pixels. And now it looks a little bit different. Now let me also try to add height to our span. So height 100 pixels. And you can see nothing changes. And the reason for this is that only block level elements can have height and width defined. Inline elements cannot have height and cannot have width. So that is something that only works on block level elements. By default, every element is either block or inline. To change that though, we can for example say that our div should have a display of inline, and this will turn our div into an inline element. Let me save this, and you can see width and height cannot be applied anymore. And I can do the exact opposite for our span. I could say our span should have a display of block. Now our span is a block level element. And now you can see our height gets applied to our element. But isn't it possible to also give them width or height, for example? So to essentially combine the best out of both. And in order to do so, we can use inline block, which essentially says you can sit in line, but now it's possible to define the width and the height. And let me actually make the text a little bit shorter so you really see how this works, like so. And you can see now they can sit next to each other, but they both have a height and a width defined. So to summarize, by saying display inline, you can turn an element into an inline element. By saying display block, you can turn an element into a block level element. And by saying display inline block, you can create an inline block element, which essentially behaves like an inline element, but can also have a width and a height. Let's now understand positioning in CSS. In order to do so, let's first of all create a normal div inside of our body, like so. And now let's style this div inside of CSS. So let's target our div, and let's give our div a width of 50 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and a background of black, for example, so we can see it. To now use positioning inside of CSS, we use the position property like so. And now there exists a couple of different values for positioning. You can use position of relative, for example, you can use position of absolute, and you can use position of fixed, for example. And those are basically the most important values. Let's start by using position relative, like so. Once you give an element positioning, you get access to the properties top, left, bottom, and right. And let me show you how this works by using top of 50 pixels, like so. I'm going to save this, and you can see our box moved a little bit to the bottom. So why is that? By adding top of 50 pixels, we say, take our element and move it 50 pixels away from the top. So essentially, give it a gap of 50 pixels to the top. Now we can do the exact same for left, for example. So we can say left 30 pixels, for example, and this will take our element and move it 30 pixels away from the left. So position relative essentially means position the element relative to its own alt position. And the alt position of this element was essentially here. So by saying top 50, we say, take the alt top position and move it 50 pixels away from the top, and then take the alt left position and move it 30 pixels away from the left. So we land right here. So that is position relative. Now I can also use position absolute. And you will see that it will barely move at all once I save. So take a look at this, and you can see it slightly moved to the top left, but it barely changed at all. So what is the reason for this? Position absolute always positions relative to the nearest position parent element. But at the moment, we don't have a position parent element, because as you can see, no element in the tree has a position yet, because we didn't give any positioning to any other elements yet. So there does not exist a parent element that has any form of positioning. Under those circumstances, position absolute takes as a reference the screen, so essentially the window. So at the moment, our reference point is essentially the screen. But usually you want to have a position parent element if you use position absolute. So let's do this right now. Let's give this div an ID of child, for example, and let's create another div that has an ID of parent, for example. So we have a div that is our parent, and inside of it we have a div that is going to be the child. And let's say this here is our child div, like so. And now let's create a parent div. So hashtag parent, that one will have a width of 150 pixels, a height of 150 pixels, a background of yellow, green, for example, like so. And now I'm going to give it a position relative. So now our child element is going to position relative to its nearest position parent element, which is now our hashtag parent element, and will therefore take this container, the hashtag parent container, as a reference point. And you can see it's slightly moved. And I can show you that this works if I use bottom of 0, for example, and left of 0. And let me make this even clearer to you. Let's just use another div right here, and this one will have an ID of random container, like so. Let's also give this a random container. So hashtag random container, a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels, and a background of brown, like so. So you can see, even though we added a parent to our div, our child still takes our hashtag parent as a reference, because only hashtag parent has positioning, and it always takes the nearest positioned parent element. It does not just take a parent element, it takes the nearest positioned parent element. And our random container is not positioned yet, so as a reference point, hashtag child uses hashtag parent. But if I'm now going to add any form of positioning to our random container, you can see that it now takes our hashtag random container as a reference point, because now hashtag random container is the nearest positioned parent container. So if I now say write 0, for example, like so, like so, you can see it takes the random container as a reference and moves to its bottom right. So that is how position absolute actually works. And now there also exists position fixed, for example, and let me show you. You can see we move to the bottom right of the window. You will actually see how this looks once I give our body a little bit more height. So height 200 viewport height. And you can see right now we have a scroll bar, because we have 200 viewport height, which is essentially more than the screen. So we are able to scroll right now. And once I start scrolling, you can see that our parent and our hashtag random container move out of the screen, whereas our hashtag child, which has a position of fixed, will stay at the exact same position. So fixed essentially just means pin this element to the screen, and it will always stay at the exact same position on the screen. And this can be useful for navigation bars, for example. Because if you think about navigation bars, oftentimes even when you scroll, they stay at the top, and you can always use them for navigation. So to summarize, position relative moves an element relative to its own old position. Position absolute moves an element relative to the nearest position parent element, and position fixed pins the element on a fixed position on the screen essentially. Let me introduce you to another concept that is called FlexBox in CSS. And that one is one of the most important concepts at all. Let me show you how this works by first of all creating a div. And that one is going to be our container div. So I call it #container, like so. And inside of this container, I want to have a couple of divs. Let's have a div that has an ID of 1, for example. And then we'll have 2 more divs. The second one will have the ID 2. And the third one will have the ID 3, like so. So let's give every single container a background color. So for example, #1 will have a width of 40 pixels, height of 40 pixels, and a background of yellow-green. Let me just copy this. Let's paste this in here 2 more times. This here will be #2. This here will be #3, like so. And we'll have different colors. So right here, let's maybe use some form of blue, doesn't matter. And right here, let's have some form of whatever this is, like so. And as you can see, at the moment, all of those elements are right below each other. But maybe if you think about an image gallery, maybe you want to have those items next to each other. So that is something that would be pretty likely or totally possible at least. And under those circumstances, you can use a flexbox. A flexbox is essentially there to create one-dimensional layouts. So maybe you want to have all of those items in a row. Maybe you want to have all of those items in a column, but have a couple more options when it comes to arranging those items properly. And that is when you want to use a flexbox. In order to have a flexbox, you always want to have a container like this. And inside of this container, you want to have the items that you want to arrange properly. So you need container and children. That is usually your starting position when you work with a flexbox. And now you say that your container will be a flexbox. And inside of this box, essentially, flexbox, we will have a couple of items, flex items. That's what you call it. So we say for #container, like so, we want to say display is equal to flex, like so. And this will activate the flexbox. And by default, the flex direction is row. So all items by default will get arranged next to each other. Most of the times, that is what you want. But from time to time, you maybe also want to have a flex direction of column. And you can also adjust the flex direction by using the flex minus direction property. And you can have column, column reverse, row, or row reverse. Let's start by taking a look at column. You can see this will just align the items in a column once again. You can have row, of course, which is just the default. You can have row, reverse, and now just take a look once I save at the order of those items. You can see this just reverses the order of the items. And of course, you can have, again, column, but also column minus reverse. Again, take a look at the order. I'm going to save, and the order just changed. But again, most of the times you will just use row. The nice thing about the flexbox is that you can also control the spacing between the individual items. So I can use the gap property to create a gap between all of those flex items by just writing a single line of code. So I could say 10 pixels, for example, and this will add a gap of 10 pixels between all of the items once I save, as you can see. And this is super nice because now you do not have to define margin for every single element. You can just use one single property to define the gap between all of the items. And this makes aligning them super easy. Now there also exists the possibility that you maybe want to arrange all of those items to the center or all of those items to the right, or you want to have some space between those items. So let me, for now, delete the gap property like so. And imagine we wanted to have all of those items arranged to the center. To arrange items within the flexbox, we use justify content. And right now you can justify the content to the center, for example. And you see, this looks like this. We can also use justify content of flex start, for example, like so. or flex minus end, like so. This will arrange the items to the end or the start. Now you can also have space between the items by using space between, for example. And this will add space between the individual items. At the moment you see the left item is arranged to the left and the right item is arranged to the right. So I can also use space around, and this will add space around all of the items. So left and right will also have a little bit of spacing then. So you can use justify content, center, flex start, flex end, space between or space around to create spacing along the primary axis. But what exactly is the primary axis? Because that is something that is really important to understand when working with the FlexBox. At the moment, we have flex direction of row, which is also the default, so I could also leave this away. But right now it's pretty good to have it to understand what justify content does. Because at the moment, we have flex direction row, which means that our primary axis is the row. Justify content aligns our content along the primary axis, which is again the row at the moment. So it aligns our content along the row. If I now change flex direction to column though, you can see that it seems like space around does not work, but the reason for this is that we do not have a height defined yet. So once we say height, 100 viewport height for example, you can see that this here works properly. And now justify content arranges our content along the column because now the column is our primary axis. So justify content always refers to the primary axis, and the primary axis is always the flex direction. So now I could also say center, for example, right here. This will align them to the center. I can use flex start again, flex end again, or space between, of course. So all of this works. But again, most of the time, flex direction is going to be row for you. So this here is a more common use case. But nevertheless, it's really important to understand the difference, because there are of course scenarios where you want to have flex direction of column, and then you still need to be able to use justify content properly. If you want to align your items along the secondary axis is always the other axis, so a flex direction is row, the primary axis is the row, and the secondary axis is the column. If flex direction is column, then the primary axis of course is column, and the secondary axis is row. And to align the items along the secondary axis, you use align minus items. And again, we have properties like center and so on. So let me use center. And this will center our items along the secondary axis, which currently is the column because flex direction is row. So row is the primary axis, column is the secondary axis, and we aligned our items along the secondary axis to the center, so along the column. We can of course also use flex end again, flex start again, and all of those things of course work. So again, to summarize, flex direction to define the primary axis and the flex direction, justify content to align along the primary axis, align items to align along the secondary axis. And that is 99% of what you will ever need. But there exist a couple more properties that you might want to use from time to time, so I'll explain them to you as well. So for now, let's delete this. Now you can also align individual items by using a different property on one of the individual flex items. So use justify content and align items to align all of the elements at once, but maybe from time to time you only want to target a single element. And in order to align a single item, a flex item, you can use align minus self instead of align items, which you would use on a container. So align items for the entire container, align minus self for an individual item. And now I can of course say flex minus end, for example. And you can see this will move this item to the end. For hashtag 2 I could say align minus self of center, like so. And for this one I could say align minus self of flex start, which will not change anything, or of course flex end, like so. Now you might wonder, does there also exist something like justify self? But to be precise, in CSS you can only align the individual items along the secondary axis. So it's not possible to solo align an item along the primary axis. So justify self doesn't work. Let me delete all of them, because we do not really need them anymore. and it's also, to be honest, a rare use case. But it's good to know that it is possible, theoretically. Now, we can also define the width, for example, of an item by using flex minus grow. So let me show you. I'm going to use flex minus grow of 1. And you can see now, hashtag 1 takes up all of the available space. By using flex minus grow, you can say that an item should grow if there is space available. And at the moment, you can see if flex grow is 0, so essentially if flex grow is disabled, there is more than enough space to the right that is available. And nothing really uses the space. So I could, for example, say if there is space available, just use the space. And I can do so by using the flex grow property on an individual flex item. And now this item will take up all of the available space if there is space available. I can also use the exact same property on another flex item. And again, I could use the value 1. And now hashtag 1 and hashtag 2 will share the available space, as you can see. And now, of course, I could do the exact same with our flex item number 3, like so. So flex grow 1. And now all of those items will share the available space. And once more space becomes available, you can see all of those items take up the available space. But now I could also increase the flex grow factor for an element. So I could say 4, for example. And you can see now hashtag 1 takes up a little more space than the other elements. I could also say 10, for example. And now hashtag 1 takes up a lot more space than the other elements. If I now give hashtag 2 a flex grow of 20, for example, though, it will grow a lot faster. So the higher the flex grow factor, the more an element is going to grow in relation to the other elements. Now there also exists something that is called flex minus shrink. So let me show you. Let me add flex minus shrink of 1, for example. And in order to demonstrate, let me first of all delete flex grow for all of those items, because we will not need it anymore, like so. And now let's just say that hashtag 2 takes up 200 pixels of width, like so. And maybe hashtag 3 will also take up 100 pixels, like so. And you can see, now hashtag 1 got a little bit smaller. I can also say flex shrink is 0. And you can see our item now stays at a width of 40 pixels. So flex shrink of 0 means that the item is not going to shrink, even if other elements would like to have the space. Flex shrink 1 means that the element can essentially shrink. And now, of course, we could give all of those elements flex minus shrink of 1, for example, like so. And now let's give hashtag 3 a width of 300 pixels, for example. And you can see now the element can shrink if the other element needs that space. So if I give this one 400, you can see the blue one is going to shrink even further. 600, it will shrink even further, and so on. So I think you get the idea. If flex shrink is actually 0, this means you cannot shrink. If flex shrink is 1, it means you can shrink if another element needs the space. Flex grow is pretty similar. If flex grow is 1, it means you can grow if there is space available. And if flex grow is 0, it means you cannot grow even if there is space available. And by default, I think you can imagine, let me just remove all of this. You can see that by default, let me go back to the default values, 50 pixels or 40, I think. And 40 right here. So let's go back to the default values. And I think you can imagine that the default value for flex grow is 0. Because of course, by default, those elements are not growing. So flex grow of 1 is not going to be the default value, but you can set it if you like to. For flex shrink, it's the complete opposite. By default, an element can shrink if he needs to. So that is the default value, but you can set it to 0 if you need to. So flex shrink of 1 is going to be the default, and flex grow of 0 is going to be default. So if those are the values that you like, you don't have to set them explicitly. You only have to set them if you want to have flex grow of 1 or flex shrink of 0. Now, instead of width, you can also use flex minus basis for a flex item. And maybe the flex basis should be 50, for example. And now you could use again flex basis of 200. And let me actually delete flex minus grow, flex minus shrink, like so. So we see how this looks. And now you can see I have a flex basis of 200 pixels right here. So hashtag 2 takes up 200 pixels of space. And for hashtag 3, I will have flex basis of 60 pixels, like so. So flex basis for a flex item is essentially just the width. And there also exists a shortcut for those properties. So you can just use flex, like so, for an individual item. And then you can define flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So we could, for example, say, let's start with a flex basis of 50 pixels, and let's save this. And now let's do the exact same for the other items. So let's just replace flex basis with our flex. And of course, I don't need it for the container. That was my bad. So let me delete it right here. And let me only apply it to our flex items, like so. And you can see now, for every single item, we have flex grow of 1, flex shrink of 1, and a flex basis of 50 pixels. I could also say flex grow of 0 for this one, and now only the other two elements would grow. And you can also just say flex of 1, flex of 1, and flex of 1. That is something that you might see from time to time. This essentially just means flex grow 1, flex shrink 1, and 0% is going to be the starting value. But since flex grow is 1 anyways, the element is just going to grow until it takes up the available space. So oftentimes you can just use flex of 1 to make it a little bit shorter, like so. Hey guys, it's me again, and I actually forgot to introduce you to one important concept regarding CSS FlexBox. And you can imagine that you could have a lot of containers right here. So maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So let's create a couple more containers right here. So let's also have 4 and 5 maybe. And I think let's also have 6, for example. We'll have ID 4, ID 5, and ID 6, for example. And now let's target those containers instead of CSS by saying hashtag 4. And now I will just copy those styles over to hashtag 4, like so. And I'll change the color. So let me maybe use a form of green. Doesn't matter too much. I'm just going to paste it in here once again for hashtag 5, like so. And now for the color, let's use maybe a form of yellow, like this. And let's also have hashtag 6, like this. And for the color, let's just use maybe something like this. And now you can see that this here already starts to get smaller and smaller. But maybe I want those items to wrap into the next line. So isn't there a possibility to say the FlexBox that we want to allow items to wrap into the new line once there's not enough space available? And in order to do so, you can use the flex minus wrap property. And by default, the flex minus wrap property is set to no wrap, but we can just say that we want to allow wrap by typing out wrap, like so. And you can see now those two boxes just wrap into a new line. And all of those items keep the defined width and height. You can also use wrap minus reverse, then you would have a reversed order, and of course the default, which would be no wrap. And there's not too much sense in writing out no wrap, since that is the default, of course. And that is all you really need to know about the CSS FlexBox. Let me now introduce you to the CSS grid. We've already seen the FlexBox, and you usually use the FlexBox if you want to create one-dimensional layouts. So if you either want to align your items horizontally, so in a row, or vertically, so in a column. If you want to align your items in 2 dimensions, you usually use the grid. And a good example would be a photo gallery. So you would have a photo right here, then right here, then right here, and then you go to the next row and you have a couple of photos there, and so on. So that would be a classical use case for a grid. And I'm just going to use a couple of boxes again to show you how this works. First of all, for a grid, we also need a grid container. And inside of the grid container, we will again have the grid items. So that is pretty similar to the FlexBox. So let's start by creating hashtag grid minus container. So a div that has the ID grid minus container. This will be, of course, our container. And inside of this container, we will now have our grid items. So we create another div, and that one could have a class grid minus item, for example. Doesn't matter. Like so. And actually, let's just use an ID right here. And let's give this one an ID of 1. This makes it a little bit easier to target later on, because I want every single grid item to have a different color, so you understand how this looks. Now let me have a couple of grid items in there. Let me have 2, 3, 4, and maybe 5. That should be enough. So 2, 3, 4, and 5, like so. Now let's style all of those elements inside of CSS. First of all, let's have hashtag grid minus container, which will be responsible for creating our grid later on. And now let's start by creating the styles for all of our grid items. So hashtag 1 will have a background of brown, and I'm just going to copy this line and paste it in 4 more times. So 2, 3, 4, and 5. This is going to be 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And let me just use slightly different colors. It doesn't matter too much, to be honest. Like so, and like so. So now, of course, we cannot see our individual items because they do not have a width and a height yet. But we can use the grid container to define the width and the height for every single row and every single column. And then our individual items are going to take up the available space by default. You will see how this works in a second, so you don't need to understand this yet. But first of all, we need to say that we want to activate the grid for this entire container. So all of those items will turn into grid items. We can do so by again using display, and instead of using display flex, we just use display grid. And now we created a grid container. As I already mentioned, a grid is 2-dimensional. So let me show it to you. So we have the first dimension that includes all of the rows. So we have a couple of rows. We can define the amount of rows later on, like so. And we can also have a couple of columns. So we could have a column right here, another one right here, then maybe one right here, and so on. And every single square right here could be one grid item. It could be a photo, for example, or it could be one of our boxes, which has a specific background color. So that is up to you. So now, first of all, we should define the number of rows. So right here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, and the number of columns. So right here we would have 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's do this. We can do so by saying grid minus template minus rows to define the amount of rows, and grid minus template minus columns to define the amount of columns. So let's start by defining the amount of rows, like so. And now I can define the height of each row by just using a pixel value. So I could say the first row should have a height of 200 pixels, and the second row should have a height of 400 pixels, like so. And you can see we're already seeing 2 of our elements. Why are we only seeing 2 of our elements? Because we defined 2 rows and we did not define any columns, so by default we only have a single column. Therefore we have enough space for our first 2 elements, so hashtag 1 and hashtag 2. And if you take a look at the colors, you also see that this is correct. So those are indeed those 2 items. So now we also need a couple of columns. So we can define columns by saying grid minus template minus columns. And it works the exact same way. We can also just define the column width by using pixel values. So maybe 100 pixels, 100 pixels, and maybe 100 pixels. So now we have 2 rows and 3 columns. So 2 times 3, so we can have 6 items in total inside of this grid. And you can see we have enough space for all of our items since we have 5 items in total. And there would also be enough space for one more item. Now, of course, it would be cooler if we could just say take up a fraction of the available space. And now I want to have 2 rows, and I want those 2 rows to automatically take up the available space. How can I do that? And I can do that by using fractions. So in total, right now, this is the available space right here. And now I can say grid template rows 1fr, 1fr, which means the first row takes up one fraction of the available space, and the second row takes up one fraction of the available space as well. And that was actually my bad because, of course, rows are the height right here. So this here takes up one fraction of the available space, and this here. I'll save this, and this disappears because we don't have a height defined yet for this entire container. So for this entire container, let's say we want to have a height of 60 viewport height. So now the first row takes up one fraction of the available space, and the second row as well. And we can do the exact same for our columns. So first column should take up one fraction of the available space. If I save this, you can say it essentially just takes up all of the available space, whereas the other two take up 100 pixels. Now I can also say one fraction for the second column, like so, and now they share the available space, whereas the third column still takes up 100 pixels, and the last one can also take up one fraction of the available space, and now they essentially just share the space. There's also a shortcut for this, so I can just say, repeat this right here, maybe 3 times, for example, and each column should maybe take up 100 pixels, like so, or 200 pixels, like so, or one fraction, for example. So all of this works. So repeat essentially just means repeat whatever we have right here for the defined amount of times, in our case 3 times, and this here defines the width of each column in this case. We can do the exact same for our rows, so we could also say repeat, let's maybe say 4 times, and we want to have rows that have a height of maybe 200 pixels, like so. Let me also show you a cool trick for doing responsive layouts, and that is essentially just using repeat together with auto minus fit, like so. And now this will automatically detect essentially how many rows there are needed, for example. So if I would have 6 columns right here, you can see it will automatically detect that we only need a single row. But now we can also do something that is called min-max right here, like so. And we can define a minimal height for each individual row and a maximum height for each individual row. So I could say I want to have a minimum height of 100 pixels and a maximum height for every single row of 300 pixels, like this. And you can see now the row takes up a maximum height of 300 pixels, like so. And that is something that you might want to use pretty often when you do responsive layouts that should work on a mobile phone and on a desktop computer, for example, and tablets, of course, as well. And the same also works for columns, and it is much more common for columns because it's really great for columns for responsive layouts again. So you can just say repeat, I want to use autofit, and now we can also use min, max, and as a minimum value, we can, for example, say we want to have 100 pixels, but as a maximum value, 250 pixels, like so. And I could also use something like 1000, for example. And now you can see, if I go to a pretty big device, like a normal desktop computer, it takes up a lot of space. On a small device, though, it will shrink and it will still take up at least 100 pixels. So that is pretty cool about using repeat together with autofit and min-max. You can also create a gap between those items. But first of all, let's say we want to repeat over 2 rows, 1fr, for example. And let's do the same for the column. So we again have a slightly better grid, like so, but we want to have 3 columns, like so. So that is our look. And now we want to create a gap between those items. We can do so again by just using the gap property. So that is pretty similar to the FlexBox. And now we can have a gap of 10 pixels between those items. And now for the grid, you maybe also want to use row gap or column gap. So maybe you only want to have a gap between the rows or the columns. So instead of gap, you can also say row minus gap of 10 pixels. Now you only have the gap between the rows, or you can use column minus gap. And now you only have the gap between the columns. And now let me also show you how to range the container properly. So imagine our container takes up 100% of the viewport height. So essentially the entire viewport. And the width is 100% of the viewport width. But now imagine our rows and columns have fixed values, like 100 pixels, for example, for every single row, and 100 pixels for every single column. So now can we somehow center this grid inside of the entire container that currently takes up 100% of the available height and 100% of the available width, so essentially the entire screen. And we can do so by using justify content to align the items on the horizontal axis, and this works pretty similar to before. So you can use center, for example, to center the items, so I centered them along the horizontal axis. You can also use different values and you can just test them out yourself. So I could also use something like end, start, and so on. So I think you get the idea. And to align the items vertically, you can again use align, but when using a grid, you don't use align minus items, you use align minus content, like so. And right here, again, you can also use something like center, start, and so on. So let's do center, center, for example. So now our entire grid would be centered. So now let's remove this here once again, and let me show you another example. So imagine every single row takes up one fraction of the available space, and every single column as well. But now it is not necessary that every single grid item takes up all of the available space. It's also possible that a grid item only has a width of 50 pixels and a height of 50 pixels. But now I also want this item to be centered right here. Maybe I don't want this item to be at the left top. So previously we've used justify content and align content to align the entire grid. To align the individual items though, we use justify minus items, because of course we are aligning items and not the entire content. So justify items, center, will center the item inside of its grid cell, and align items the exact same. So I see how this works. And now let's also define a width and a height for the other items, because we should do so if we want to have the effect like so, and so, and so. And I think you understand how this works. You could now also align every individual container on its own by using align minus self and justify minus self. So justify minus self to align horizontally, align minus self to align vertically. So justify minus self could be start, for example, for the first one, and this will override the general property right here. And I can also say align minus self of start, for example. So start like this, and this will align this item inside of its container. For now, let's just remove all of this, so all of the width and height properties for the individual items, so they just take up the entire columns and rows again, like so. So let me save this, let me also remove this right here, and let's also remove justify items and align items, like so. So now we have the same result we had previously, like this. But now I can of course also say that I want this container, for example, so #1, to span over maybe 2 or 3 columns. So that is up to us. And we can do so by saying grid minus column, for example, on the child element, so on the grid item. And now we can define how many columns this item should span, for example. So I could say span 2 like this. So this means just take up 2 columns of width. I can also say span 3, for example. And you can do the exact same for rows by using grid minus row. And now you could also say span 2, for example. So now it spans over 2 rows. And we can also let this automatically decide how many rows we need by just saying auto right here. And now we'll just display all of the items. Instead of just using span, we can also define a starting and an end position. And let me show you how this works by drawing it out for you again. So you gotta visualize it like that. This here is essentially point number 1. This here is point number 2. This is point number 3. And this is point number 4. So every column is essentially 1 point. And of course the same works for the rows. So this here is point number 1 for the rows. This is point number 2 for the rows. This is point number 3 for the rows. And this is point number 4. So that is how you have to think about it right now. And now you can also just say that hashtag 1 should start in column number 1 and should maybe go up to point number 3. So 1 from 1 to 2 to 3. So up to this point. So 1, 3, and we get this result. And now I could say for hashtag 2, for example, go from point number 3 to point number 4. So I can say grid minus column 3/4 like this. So I get the exact same result. And of course for the row I can do the exact same. So grid minus row. And maybe I want to go from 1 to 2 to 3. So 1/3. And now it spans from 1 to 3. And of course I can do the exact same for item number 3. So maybe I want to go from column 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. So up to the end. So I can do grid minus column 1/4. So now it takes up the entire row. And I know the grid can be a little bit confusing, but I just recommend you to try it out once or twice, and I'm sure you will get the hang of it. Let's now understand pseudo classes in CSS. In order to do so, let's first of all create a button. And inside of this button, we could, for example, have the text click me. Doesn't really matter for now. And now let's just do some basic styling for this button. Let's target the button with an element selector. Let's give it a background of maybe white for now, but let me actually use a slightly darker version of white, like so. Maybe a little bit brighter. I think this is okay. Now I'm going to say for the border, I want to have a border of 0 pixels. So the border is essentially gone. And I want to have padding top bottom of maybe 10 pixels and left right of maybe 25 pixels. So this is just a basic button. Something that you can also do if you want to style a button is use the cursor property. So I can say cursor, and if you then say pointer, so property cursor, value pointer, then your mouse will turn into a cursor once you go over the button. So that is something that is pretty useful if you work with buttons. But now let's take a look at the pseudo classes. What is a pseudo class? Usually you use a pseudo class by using the selector, followed by a colon, followed by the pseudo class. So 1 colon followed by the pseudo class. And one of the pseudo classes that we're going to look at is the hover pseudo class. And this one essentially means target this element once we hover over it and apply the styles that we'll now define inside of those braces to that element. So once we hover over this element, maybe we want to have a slightly different background. So maybe yellow-green. Doesn't need to look good for now, but you will see the difference. So I'm going to hover over this element and you can see it becomes green. I can also say that the color should be white, for example, like so. And now you can see we have a white text color and a yellow-green background. Now there exist all kinds of pseudo classes. Another pseudo class would be colon active, for example, like so. And now you see when I hover, nothing really happens. But once I click on this element, so once the element is active, we are getting those styles. So hover targets an element once we hover over it, and active targets an element once we click the element. And that's something that you might want to use from time to time for buttons, for example. Now there also exists the focus pseudo class. Let me show you. Let's first of all delete all of those styles, and let's just create a basic input field of type text, for example, like so. Now let's target this input field, and let's target it once we focus the input element. And let's say once we focus the input element, we want to have a background of yellow-green, for example, again. What does focus mean? Focus essentially means when we select the input element, apply those styles. And you can see once selected, so once the cursor is inside of this input element, we're having a background of yellow-green. Let me now introduce you to the visited pseudo class. Let's delete this. And in order to do so, let me now add an anchor tag right here. And that one says, go to this site, for example. I'll also add an href attribute that goes to a random baseball site, I guess. I'm going to use target equals underline blank to open it in a new tab. And now I'm going to go to my style sheet I target an anchor tag that has been visited, essentially, like so. And I say once the site has been visited, I want to have a color of yellow-green, like so. You can see by default, this link right here looks pretty normal. Now I can click on the site. I'm going to go back, and you can see now our link is green. So the text is essentially yellow-green. And the reason for this is because we have now visited this website. So the visited pseudo class will select an element once it has been visited. So once a user has been on the page, for example. Now let's take a look at the checked pseudo class. So let's just delete this right here. And let's add an input of type checkbox, like so. Let's target this input and let's check whether it has been checked, for example. And when this input is checked, I want to give it a width of 50 pixels and a height of 50 pixels. Now I'm going to check it, and you can see it gets a lot bigger. So the check pseudo class will target an element once it has been checked. Now let's delete this and let's take a look at a couple more pseudo classes. Let me, for example, have a div or an unordered list to be precise. And inside of this unordered list, I want to have a couple of li items. This is going to be item 1, 2, and 3, like so. So now I have 3 items, and maybe I only want to target the first list item. So I can do so by saying li first minus child, like so. And the first child will have a background of yellow-green. And you can see only the first list item will have a background of yellow-green. Why is that? The reason for this is that first child will only target the first child element that is a list. And only this here is the first child element, because this here is the second child and this here is the third child. Therefore, we're only going to target this one. We can also, instead of using first child, use last child. Now we will target the last one. And we can also use nth child, like so. And right here we can, for example, say inside of brackets 2n, for example, which will target every second child element. So let me duplicate this here a couple more times. And you can see every second element will get targeted. You can also do 3n, like so, 4n, or 1n. So I think you get the idea. I could also use odd for all of the odd elements, or even for all of the even elements. Let me introduce you to pseudo elements, and there exist 2 important pseudo elements, before and after. In order to show them to you, let me first create a paragraph that says hello, for example. And now let me target this paragraph instead of CSS, and now I can use a pseudo element by using so 2 colons. And now, as mentioned, there exists after or before, for example. So let me show you before first of all. When using before, you have access to the content property right here, like so. And now, as a string, you can define some content, for example. So I could say, I am saying, for example. I'm going to save this, and you can see we are having I'm saying hello. So before adds some content before a certain element. So for example, before this p tag. And now you can just style this content the way you would style any other element. So I could give it a background of brown, you could give it a color of white, and so on. So I think you get the idea. And now, as I mentioned, there exists another pseudo element, and that would be after. It is pretty much the exact same. The only difference is that after, of course, adds something after a certain element. Something that you might want to do from time to time is set display to block, because now it behaves like a block level element. Because you've seen by default, it more or less behaved like an inline element. But that is, of course, up to you. And under our circumstances, this is probably even what we want. So we could say, hello, bro, like so. And this here would be totally valid, like so. So before to add something before an element, after to add something after an element. Let me now introduce you to box shadow and text shadow. Imagine you have a box, a div for example. And let's give this div a certain width of 50 pixels and a certain height of maybe 50 pixels, as well as a background of brown. So this is our div right now. But now maybe we want to have a slight shadow around this div, so around this box. In order to create a shadow in CSS, you can use the box minus shadow property. And now we have to define a couple of values for box minus shadow. The first value is X offset, the second one is Y offset, the third one is the blur, and the last one is the color. Let me show you. We can define the X offset by using an amount of pixels, for example, so 10 pixels, Y offset as well, so maybe 10 pixels as well. Let's use for the blur 40 pixels, and for the color, let's use black. And you can see we now have this shadow right here. So let me demonstrate all of those properties in detail. The blur defines how blurry the shadow is, so how soft the shadow is. If I use blur of 0 pixels, you can see that we have a hard shadow right here. Let me also remove the Y offset, so I see what the Y offset is essentially, like so. And you can see the Y offset defines the offset in the Y direction, so top and bottom essentially. So I can say minus 10 pixels, for example, 10 pixels, and so on. So this moves the shadow from top to bottom, or from bottom to top. And the X offset does the exact opposite. It moves the shadow from left to right, or from right to left. So that is up to you. So I can say 0 pixels right here. And now we have 0 offset on the x-axis, and I can also say minus 10 pixels or 10 pixels. So I think you get the idea. We can also use RGBA values for the shadow, or for the color to be precise, and that is something that you might want to do pretty often, because then you also have transparency, and you can define how strong the shadow should be essentially. So 0.3, for example, is not that strong, whereas 1 is of course a stronger shadow. So let me show you 0.3, and let's use 10 pixels for the blur. So this is how you can create a box shadow. And of course you can also do 0, 0, 10 pixels, and then you just have a soft shadow of 40 pixels. Let me do this one a little bit stronger so you see it. So you have a lot of possibilities when using a box shadow. But how can you actually add a shadow to text? Let me just add a random text, hello bro, for example. And now let me target this paragraph, and let me just try to paste over this box minus shadow property. And you can see this looks pretty weird, because by default, of course, you can also represent a paragraph as a box, because everything in HTML gets represented as a box. But under those circumstances, it would be a little bit better if the shadow would only be around the text. And in order to do so, we can use the text minus shadow property, like so. And now the text shadow property also expects 4 values. Again, X offset, Y offset, blur, and color. So it's pretty much the exact same. The only difference is that you have text shadow instead of box shadow. So let's use black as a color, blur of 0 for now, Y offset of 0 pixels, and let's use X offset of 0 pixels. So right now we're not seeing anything. Let me add some X offset. So now we have some offset on the x-axis. Let me also add Y offset. Now we have X and Y offset. Let me add some blur of 10 pixels maybe. Now it's a little bit blurry. And now let me also change the color to yellow, for example. So now we have a yellow shadow. So I think you get the idea. Only difference is that you have text minus shadow instead of box minus shadow. Let's now understand media queries. In order to do so, let me first create a div right here. And let me now target this div inside of CSS and give it a width of maybe 1000 pixels and maybe a height of 400 pixels. I also want to have a background of brown. And once I save this, you can see that we have this box right here. And while this might look kind of right on a big device, it is definitely not looking good on a small device. Let me show you. Let's right click the page, let's inspect, and once you click this icon right here, you can change to a mobile device. So let me click it, and now you can drag those bars right here and change the device size. And you can also change to an iPhone, for example, to an iPhone XR, to an iPad mini, and so on. So you can see this on all kinds of devices. And maybe this looks kind of right on a big device and you still have a little bit of space to the right, but on a small device or on a small screen size, it looks kind of weird. So isn't there a possibility to adapt or adjust this container or elements in general to the screen size, so it looks good on pretty much every single device? And in fact, there is something like that, and that is called a media query. You can create a media query by using @media. Now you can define the type of media. Usually it is going to be screen. Screen just means this media query will affect screens. So essentially a screen on a tablet, a screen on a phone, a screen in a browser window, so any type of screen. You could also do something like print if you want to write a media query when printing something on paper, for example, but that is something that you usually don't do. So usually you say @media screen. And afterwards, instead of brackets, you can define a rule. This can be something like max minus width, min minus width, and so on. So all of this stuff works. We want to say that we want to have a max minus width. And now let's define 1000 pixels, for example. So as long as our width is less than 1000 pixels, I want to apply something to our div. So now I can target our div inside of this media query, and I can say our width should only be 40 pixels. And maybe our height should also only be 40 pixels. And let me actually change this to 100 so we see it a little bit better. And you can see for a device that has a max width of 1000 pixels, we will get those effects or those styles. Otherwise, we should get those styles. Let me show you. Let me maximize the window. And you can see on a big device, we have the super big box again. But if I'm now going to go to responsive and I'll make this smaller and smaller, at a certain point, we will get the small box right here. So depending on the device size, we get a different result. And we can do the exact same for pretty much any element. So I could also write some text right here. Hello, guys. And now I want to say that usually I want to have a color of black, which is also the default. But otherwise, I want to have a color of yellow-green, for example. And you can see currently we have color yellow-green. But let me resize this and you can see now we have black. So once we reach 1000 pixels, which you can also see right here, once we hit that point, we're going to switch overlay essentially. And you can see once I get below 1000, we're having green and a small box. And now once I hit 1000, we're having a big box and black. So I think you get the idea. By using a media query, you can write rules for your design. And of course, you could also do something like this. Now it would be pretty small above 1000 pixels and below it would get pretty big, which wouldn't make too much sense, but I think you understand how this works. And something like this might seem unnecessary for a lot of you at first, but writing media queries is probably the most important thing out of this course. Today, a lot of people will click your websites on a mobile phone, for example, on a tablet, or on something else. Not all of the traffic will come from your browser. And in the future, it is likely that even more people will visit your websites using a phone. And if a website looks completely ugly on a mobile device, no one will really watch your website. And if people leave your websites instantly, Google will also think that your website is bad and therefore not recommend your website as much. Therefore, having a website that looks good on mobile and desktop is really important. And you always want to make sure, by using those media queries, that your website looks good on all kinds of devices. Let me now introduce you to transform. In order to do so, let's first of all, as always, create a div. And let's target this div in CSS, give it a width of 50 pixels, or let's say 100 pixels. Let's give it a height of 100 pixels. And let's give it a background of, again, yellow-green, like so. So now we have our div. And now there exists a property that allows us to transform this div. Let me show you. We can use transform right here. And now we can use a lot of different properties or a lot of different functions to be precise. We can use the scale function, for example, which allows us to scale this rectangle. So we could say we want to scale by the factor 1.5, for example. And this will just scale our square. We can also use 0.5, for example, and this will shrink our rectangle. We can also use 2 to double the size, and so on. Now we can stack a lot of different functions right here to transform our square. So we could also use rotate, for example. And right here we could do something like 30 degrees, for example, and this will just rotate our square. We can also use 360, which is a full rotation, so we're not seeing a difference, 45, and so on. So scale scales the rectangle, rotate rotates it. Now we can also use skew, for example, which will just shift it a little bit, maybe 10 degrees. And let me actually delete the other two so we see it a little bit better. You can see we can skew it by 10 degrees, minus 10 degrees, and so on. That is something that you probably won't use that often, at least I've never used it. But in case you want, you can of course also skew it. This here is actually the angle on the x-axis, but you can also skew on the y-axis by using a second value right here. And now this skews on the y-axis. Let me delete this. And now you can also translate it. So move it to the left, right, bottom, whatsoever. So we can use translate x to move it on the y-axis. For example, 50 pixels to the right, minus 50 to the left. So translate x moves on the x-axis. And now we can also use translate y to move on the y-axis. So minus 50, which means to the top, or 50 pixels, which means we move to the bottom. So to summarize, we can use transform together with the function scale, like so, rotate, like so, skew, like so, and translate if we wanted to do that, like so. And it might seem kind of useless at first, but you will see in a second a scenario where this can be really, really useful. So let's just remember it for now. Let me introduce you to transitions. Imagine the scenario previously. We have a button right here, and inside of this button, we have a text, click me, for example. Let me actually make this a little bit bigger for you so you see what is going on. And now I'm going to style this button. So let me give this button a background of maybe white, but I want to have a slightly darker version of white again, like so. I will use a color of maybe black and a border of 0, like this. Now I want to have padding, top, bottom, 10 pixels and 30 pixels left, right. And this here should be padding, of course. And now we have this button. Maybe I want to have a cursor pointer so I can hover over it and it looks clickable. And a property that you might want to use from time to time as well is going to be the border minus radius property, because that one allows you to create a border radius. And you can define it by using pixels. So 5 pixels, for example. And you see we have slightly rounded borders right now. So I think that looks pretty cool always. And I use it a lot on buttons. But that's not the point of this video. I want to show you how we can create a smooth transition between two states. So imagine we have the button hover state right here, and now we want to have a background of yellow, green, for example. You can see once we hover, we have this background of yellow, green, and maybe also a color of white, as you can see. But the transition is really abrupt, and I want to have a smooth transition. So how can I do it? I can create transitions between two states by using the transition property right here. As the first argument, I have to define the properties I want to apply this transition to. So I could say I want to apply it for our color, for example, like so. Second argument is going to be the transition. This could be 2 seconds, for example, so the transition time to be precise. And the third one is going to be a timing function. This can be something like ease in out, ease out, step end, and so on. Most of the times I just use ease, and essentially the timing function just means how does the animation play? Does the animation start slow and end fast? Does it start slow, become fast, end slow, and so on? And you can just take a look at all of the timing functions by just saying CSS timing functions, for example. And now you go over there and you can see a couple of different examples. So animation timing function linear, for example. Let's play it. And you can say linear just means play the animation at a constant speed. Let's use ease in out. So let's use this one. And you can see it starts slow, gets faster, and slow. Let's take a look at steps. So steps actually just has a couple of steps. So I think you get the idea. And you can just test those functions out if you want to know more about them or just read a little bit about them. But again, usually you can just use Is, for example. Let me save this. Let me hover over this, and you can see our color gets animated slowly. We can also animate our background, like so. And you can see our background gets animated. But usually I just do all most of the time, which means just animate all of them. Now I'm going to hover over this, and you can see we have a smooth transition. And actually, this here is a little bit too much, so I'll use 0.5. And you can see now we have a cool transition when hovering over this button. You can also add a delay, which I barely ever use, but in case you want to do it, you can do it. Maybe 2 seconds. And you can see now, after 2 seconds, we get a transition. But again, I usually don't use this, so it doesn't matter too much. And again, in case you only want to specify different properties, but multiple at a time, you just do it like this. Background 0.5 Is, for example. Color 0.5 Is, for example. So you can just specify one property after another. And now you get this effect essentially. So that is up to you. Let me now introduce you to animations, which is in my opinion one of the coolest things in CSS, because you can literally animate anything. Let me show you. Let's for now just create a div, and let's start by creating a basic animation. Let's style this div by giving it a width of 50 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and a background of brown, for example. Let's save this one, let's save this one, and now we should have this square right here. And now we can create an animation by first defining it. So first of all, we have to define an animation, and we can do so by using add keyframes, like so. So this here just says we want to create an animation. After that add keyframe statement, we have to define a name for our animation. And this can be pretty much anything. This can just be cool, for example. So now I create an animation that has the name cool. Now you have those opening and closing brackets once again. And inside of this animation definition, you use the from keyword with those brackets. And afterwards, you use a to keyword with those brackets. So you're going from one state to another state, essentially. Right here, you define the first state, so the starting state, and right here, you define the ending state. So I could, for example, say, I want to start with the color brown, for example, and I want to end with the color yellow, for example, like so. So that is possible. So now we already defined an animation that will animate the background. To be precise, the background color from brown to yellow. How can we now apply this animation that we defined right here to this element, to this div? And that one is pretty easy. We can just use animation. In the VS Code, we already get this predefined property essentially. And you can see we have to fill out a lot of stuff right here. So the first thing we have to define right here for the animation property is our name. So we can just say name is going to be cool, because that is our animation name. So right here we want to play the animation cool. Now we can define a duration. How long should it take to go from this state to this state? In our case, maybe 4 seconds. We also have to define a timing function again. Again, we looked at timing functions previously. Oftentimes you can just use is, you can use linear, and so on. So let's try linear, for example. Delay. I don't really want to have a delay, so I'm just going to delete that one. Iteration count. Right here, you can, for example, define a number, or you could say infinite if you wanted to loop forever. But for now, let's just use 3. For the direction, you can just have normal, for example, which is essentially just forward, or you can say reverse, alternate reverse, and so on. I don't think that this is useful pretty often, because usually if you want an animation to run backwards, why wouldn't you just define it backwards in the first place? But of course, if you have multiple elements and you want to have it go forward for one element and backward for another one, then it might be useful. So you can use reverse right here, or you can just leave it away. That's up to you. I'll just leave it away. And fill mode, you'll see what that one does in a second. But for now, let me just save this, and you can see now our animation is playing. So it's going from brown to yellow essentially, jumps back to brown, goes to yellow, jumps back to brown, and now after 3 iterations, it jumps back to brown and stays there. So we also had fill mode, as already said. And now for the fill mode, you could, for example, say this animation should play forward and therefore stay at the end, so stay at the last frame, by saying forward. And now you can see we're going from brown to yellow, from brown to yellow, and we go one more time from brown to yellow. And then, since we're playing forward, we'll stay at the last frame, right here. So this time it will be yellow at the end. And the opposite would essentially be backwards. So now it would go from brown to yellow, but the last frame is going to be brown. And I actually barely ever used it. I actually never used it. But in case you want to do it for whatever reason, then you can do it like this. Something that you might want to use pretty often though is infinite for the animation duration, because now this here will loop forever and ever and ever. Let me just use 1 second. And you can see it will just loop forever and it will never stop. This animation here is pretty boring though. So let me show you something cooler. We can also use percentages right here. So you can say 0% to 50%, for example, to 100%. And now I can just say for the background, I want to end at brown in the end. And now it loops and it looks a little bit better already. Now we can also use things like transforms, for example. So we can say transform, we can scale it, we can start with a scale of 1, for example. We can go to a scale of 1.1 and we can go back to a scale of 1 at the end. And you can see like this we can create more complex animations. We could also use translate X, for example, 50 pixels. And let's actually use 0 in the beginning. Let's go to 50 pixels. And let's go back to 0 pixels. And of course, I need pixels right here. And now you can see, it looks pretty weird, but you can see that you can do a lot of cool stuff by using those transforms. You could, for example, make the square go top to bottom, left to right, or create all forms of cool animations by doing so. Let me introduce you to variables. Imagine we are having a div right here. And as always, we just want to target our div. We want to give it a width of 50 pixels, a height of maybe 50 pixels as well, and a background of yellow, green. So just our normal div. But now there also exist variables in CSS. And I'll actually just show them to you because it's probably a little bit easier. And afterwards, I'll explain them. We're going to target :root. What is :root? :root is essentially our HTML element right here. So that is the root element. And usually you want to define your variables for the root element, so for our HTML element, because then you can access them instead of your entire document. Like so. Then you use opening and closing brackets, just the normal way. And now you define a variable by using -- followed by the variable name. And something that is pretty normal in CSS is, for example, using primary minus color for your primary color. So for the color that you want to use most often inside of your document. And now we can, for example, just use yellow-green right here as our primary color, like so. And now for the background, instead of saying yellow-green, I can use the var function and I can just access -- primary color. And we're still getting the exact same effect, but the difference is, imagine I would use this primary color here 1,000 times. So maybe I also have a paragraph, hello, and now I will use the exact same color for the paragraph color. So I use var primary color. Now its paragraph has the exact same color. Maybe I also have this background somewhere else, this color somewhere else, and so on. So I think you get the idea. Maybe I want to use this color across the entire document. But now if I want to change this color, I would have to go to every single spot and change the color, which is of course pretty annoying and not really time efficient. So I can just use a variable. And now if I want to change the color of this variable for all of the elements where I've used this variable, I can just go to one place, change it to blue, for example. I'm going to save this and you can see everything else now changes to blue. So a variable essentially allows you to define a value at one single spot and then reuse it across an entire document and change all of the colors with one single click. And that's the power of variables. Again, you define a variable inside the root element, so inside the HTML element essentially. A variable starts with dash dash followed by the variable name, and then you can just define the value. You can use the variable by using the var function, and inside of the brackets, you just access the variable name. So it's pretty easy. But variables are not limited to colors. Of course, you can also define a variable for the border width, for example, if you wanted to. And that one could be 10 pixels. Now imagine I want to have a border right here. I'm going to access var of border width right here. Oops, border width. Then I want to have a solid border. And for the color, I want to use var primary color, for example. So now I have this border that has as a color the primary color and as a width the border minus width. So I think you get the idea. Now 10 is maybe too much, so I'll change that to 1. And again, only one single spot where I have to change the value. So this is really efficient. At this point, you know pretty much all you really need to create a cool website. But you've probably realized a couple of weird things. So I want to explain them to you. Let's start by creating a div again. Let me give this div a width of 50 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and a background of brown. As you can see, we have a lot of space right here to the left and to the top, even though we've never really set a margin, for example. So why is that? And the reason for this is that HTML by default adds a little bit of margin to the body. So let me just inspect this right here. Let's go back to the desktop view. And once you hover over the body and click the body, you can see that the web browser by default adds a margin of 8 pixels right here. And for most websites, that is something that you do not want to have. And to fix this, usually you use the universal selector, which is an asterisk, which just means everything. And you're going to reset margin to 0. This will reset the margin for the entire document to 0. And you can see now this looks clean. The second thing is, you will also oftentimes just set padding to 0 to get a clean starting point. So now everything should have margin 0, padding 0. If I'm now going to create a paragraph as well, that says hello, for example, previously we've seen that a paragraph usually has a little bit of margin top bottom, but that margin is now gone as well. So this here is a lot cleaner and a lot better to work with, because otherwise you would have to look at a lot of elements, would have to reset margins or paddings that the browser adds by default and so on. And that is something that you do not want. So those are things that you always add when you start creating a new website. And something that you also do is add box sizing of border box. So those 3 things will usually be added when you start a new project. But what is box sizing border box? Let me show you. Let me remove this first of all. And let me just add a little bit of padding right here. Let me minimize this window right here. And let me just add padding of 50 pixels or 40 pixels. And you can see this box got a lot bigger. So usually when you don't have box sizing border box, padding always gets added to the content. Even though I defined a width of 50 pixels and a height of 50 pixels, my box is now a lot bigger because it also added padding of 40 pixels to the content. To avoid this, I can use box sizing of border box. And this will fix this problem. This will say 50 pixels width, 50 pixels height, and nothing more than that. And padding now gets added inside essentially. So now this here is probably the content and this here is padding. And this also gives you a lot more control over how your layout looks, because you never want padding to break your layout. So to sum up, even if you don't understand what this does, even though I think you will, just add this in the beginning when you start a new project and you should be good to go. And this is all you really need to know about CSS. I really hope you enjoyed this course, and if you've understood a lot of this, I recommend you to do a couple of practice projects and then go on and learn JavaScript.